Imagine a world where the most reliable thing in human life simply weakens, not disappears in fire, not ends in a single catastrophe, but fades into a pale, distant light. Crops hesitate. Bodies wait for warmth that does not come. Generations built to trust the morning sky discover that survival can depend on something no hand can reach. If the sun itself could seem to fail, what did human beings lose in that long dimming? In 536 AD, did the sun vanish for 18 months, and why do we still not know exactly why? To understand the strange darkness of 536, it is better to begin with the oldest habit of the human body, waking beneath a sky that returns. Long before cities, calendars, kings, and written records, human beings learned the shape of a day from light. Morning was not only a time, it was warmth on skin, colour on leaves, distance made visible, the slow permission to move, gather, plant, travel, and work. The first human communities did not control the sun, but they built their lives around its return so deeply that its rhythm became almost invisible. People could doubt a ruler, lose a harvest, abandon a road, or survive a storm. But the coming of daylight belonged to a deeper trust, older than any empire. That is why the reports from the middle of the 6th century feel so unsettling. They do not describe a sudden night that swallowed the world. They describe something quieter, and in some ways more disturbing. A sun that still rose yet seemed weakened, distant, unable to give its ordinary strength. Some writers from the Mediterranean world remembered a dimness in the air, a light without normal brightness, a year in which shadows and seasons did not behave as expected. Later readers sometimes turn that into the simple phrase, "the sun vanished." But the history is more careful than that. The sun did not stop existing. The earth did not leave its orbit. Human beings were facing a sky that appeared changed from below, as if something had come between their lives and the source they depended on. For farmers, this was not a small detail of weather. The sun was stored in grain before it became bread. It was stored in pasture before it became milk or meat. It was stored in wood before it became winter heat. A weakened sky could move slowly through every human need, from the field to the stomach, from the stomach to the strength of a family, from the family to the stability of a settlement. This is where the story returns to the beginning of our species. Humans are not creatures separated from climate. Our bodies carry memories of open landscapes, changing seasons, hunger, migration, and the search for reliable food. We became intelligent not because the world was always kind, but because survival often depended on reading signs: cloud, wind, animal movement, fruiting plants, drying rivers, the length of days. In 536, the sign overhead may have become difficult to read. The morning came, but perhaps not with the old certainty. The cold did not need to kill at once to become dangerous. It only had to shorten growth, delay ripening, weaken storage, and make the next season harder than the last. No single village would have understood the full pattern. A person standing in a field could not see sulfate in ice, or the narrow rings that trees would leave behind for future scientists. They could only feel the change as a practical question. Would the crop finish? Would the animals endure? Would children have enough to eat when the weather turned again? The power of 536 lies in that gap between lived experience and hidden cause. Today, we can compare texts, ice, trees, and climate evidence, and we can say that a major disturbance in the atmosphere is the most accepted explanation. But for the people who lived beneath that dimmed sky, the event did not arrive as data. It arrived as failed warmth, uncertain seasons, and a quiet pressure on ordinary life. The first step, then, is not to imagine a dramatic apocalypse. It is to imagine the loss of confidence in the most basic pattern human beings had ever known. Light returns, warmth follows, and the world can be prepared for. In 536, that ancient confidence was shaken, not by darkness alone, but by daylight that no longer felt fully like daylight. The oldest witnesses to the dimming of 536 did not speak with the language of modern climate science. They did not know about particles high in the atmosphere, or ice cores, or the way a volcanic cloud can spread across the upper air. They wrote from the ground, from cities, roads, fields, monasteries, courts, and communities, where the sky was not an abstract thing. The sky decided when labor began. It decided when grain could ripen. It decided how far a traveler could see, how warm a child might sleep, and whether a farmer could believe the year was still following its proper order. This is why the ancient descriptions matter. They are not perfect measurements, but they are human records of a disturbance large enough to be remembered. In the Eastern Roman world, Procopius described a sun that gave light without its usual brightness, a sun that seemed almost like an eclipse. The detail is important because an eclipse is temporary, expected to pass. What frightened people about this memory was not one brief shadow, but a strange persistence, as if ordinary daylight had lost part of its force and did not quickly recover. In Italy, Cassiodorus wrote in language that joins observation with unease. He spoke of weak rays, diminished warmth, a moon without splendor, and seasons that seemed confused. Whether every phrase should be read as exact weather reporting or as literary expression, the picture still points in the same direction. People noticed a failure of normal light and normal seasonal feeling. Noon itself, the hour when sunlight should be strongest, no longer carried the same certainty. A world built around agriculture could not treat that as a small oddity. When the sun seemed weak, the field became uncertain. When the field became uncertain, the storage room became important. When storage became important, every family began to measure time differently, not by feast days or imperial years alone, but by how long food might last. Other records, written in different places and traditions, also preserve the sense of a difficult year. Some annals remember failures of bread. Some later chronicles speak of the sun shining feebly for a year and a half. These accounts do not need to be forced into perfect agreement to be useful. Ancient records were written for different reasons, by different people, with different calendars and assumptions. Yet when scattered voices preserve the memory of dim light, poor harvests, cold or hunger, they begin to form a pattern. The careful question is not whether every detail is literal in the same way. The careful question is why so many observers found the sky and seasons worthy of recording at all. Most years passed without becoming symbols of disorder. A bad storm could be remembered locally. A failed crop could wound one region. But 536 entered historical memory because the disturbance seemed to reach beyond ordinary inconvenience. It touched the basic relationship between humans and the environment that had shaped our species from the beginning. Long before writing existed, people survived by matching their bodies and behavior to the world around them. They learned when to move, when to wait, when animals migrated, when plants ripened, when cold returned, and when light lengthened again. Civilization did not erase that dependence. It only covered it with roads, markets, taxes, armies, and laws. Beneath those structures, human life still rested on weather, calories, and seasons. A dim sky could therefore pass through society like a quiet pressure. It could make wheat slow, grapes sour, fruit hard, pasture thin, and winter stores more valuable. It could turn a normal household calculation into a question of endurance. No chronicler could see the whole northern hemisphere. No farmer could compare tree rings across continents. No official could know whether the same haze was being seen beyond distant mountains or seas. But each person could recognize when the light above them no longer behaved like the light they had trusted since childhood. That is the deep unease behind the old reports. They are not merely saying that the weather was unpleasant. They are preserving a moment when the most familiar signal in human life became strange. The sun still rose, but the meaning of morning had changed. Daylight arrived, yet it did not fully reassure. For people whose ancestors had followed the sun across open ground, through ice ages, migrations, harvests, and settlements, this was not just a phenomenon in the sky. It was a disturbance in the ancient agreement between the human body and the world that fed it. The phrase "the sun vanished" is powerful because it says in a few words what fear may have felt like from the ground. Yet for a truthful telling, it must be held carefully. The sun did not go away. The earth did not fall into a long astronomical night. There was no known moment when daylight stopped crossing the world. What appears in the evidence is stranger in a quieter way, a period when sunlight was dimmed, warmth was reduced, and the sky seemed altered for people across regions. To call it a disappearance can help a listener feel the shock of the age, but to leave it there would be misleading. The more accurate thought is that something likely came between human life and the sun's full strength, not as a wall, but as a veil spread high above weather. This distinction matters because human beings often experience nature through effects before they understand causes. A child feels cold before knowing the motion of air. A farmer sees a pale sky before knowing what floats above it. A family notices grain failing before any explanation exists. In 536, the experience may have been built from repeated uncertainties: morning light that looked weak, midday warmth that did not arrive, plants that seemed slow, nights that felt too cold, and seasons that no longer gave the usual signs. None of this requires the sun to vanish in a literal sense. It only requires the light reaching human bodies and fields to lose enough strength that life began to notice. That is an old kind of danger. From the beginning, our species survived by reading the world as a chain of signals. Light meant visibility, warmth meant movement, longer days meant growth, ripening meant food could be gathered, stored, and shared. These links were never perfect, but they were reliable enough to shape memory, habit, and settlement. When the links weakened, the mind did not need a scientific explanation to feel alarm. A dim sky would have disturbed not only the eye, but also the planning systems of a community. When should seed go into the earth? Would frost come late or early? Would fruit mature? Would animals find pasture? Would stored food last until the next reliable harvest? These were not dramatic questions. They were daily questions, and that is why they were so serious. A great disaster is sometimes imagined as a single event, but many climate shocks work by stretching uncertainty across time. One cloudy day can be ignored. One cold week can be endured. But a season that refuses to behave begins to touch every layer of human life. It affects food before politics, bodies before chronicles, and ordinary people before rulers can explain it. Later, science gives the event a wider frame. Tree rings from some regions show signs of poor growth around this period, suggesting cold conditions. Ice records preserve chemical traces that support the idea of a major volcanic disturbance, perhaps more than one, sending material into the upper atmosphere. These clues do not turn ancient fear into myth. They make it more understandable. They show how a distant eruption, unseen by most who suffered its consequences, could change the light over fields. Still, careful language is important. The evidence points strongly toward atmospheric dimming connected to volcanic activity, but the exact source, scale, and regional effects remain subjects of study. The honest story is not that nobody knows anything. It is that we know enough to see the outline, but not enough to close every question. That uncertainty belongs inside the narrative. It protects the story from becoming false. For the people of 536, the sky did not need to break the laws of nature to feel broken. It only had to weaken the ancient promise that daylight would bring warmth. Warmth would bring growth, and growth would carry human beings through another year. Before the sky of 536 became a problem for kingdoms, records, and later historians, it was first a problem for the body. Human life is often described through tools, cities, languages, and belief. But beneath all of those things there is a quieter dependence. The body expects light. It expects warmth. It expects the slow difference between morning and evening, between winter and summer, between the time to store energy and the time to spend it. This expectation did not begin with civilization. It reaches back to the long beginning of human life, when our ancestors moved through landscapes where daylight shaped almost every choice. Light made predators easier to see. It made paths safer. It revealed water, plants, tracks, faces, and shelter. Darkness did not only mean the absence of sight. It changed the nervous system, the pace of movement, the range of safety, and the way a group gathered close. In that sense, the sun was never just an object in the sky. It was one of the first organizers of human behavior. Even after people learned to build fires, store grain, shape metal, and live inside walls, the body still carried that older relationship. A 6th century farmer, soldier, monk, child, or ruler did not need to understand biology to live by its rhythms. The body wakes differently in light than in darkness. It works differently in warmth than in cold. It judges distance, danger, and labor through the conditions around it. When the sky becomes dim for too long, the disturbance enters through the eyes, the skin, the lungs, the stomach, and the mind. It is not only seen, it is felt. If the reports from 536 describe a sun that seemed weak and a year that felt cold or disordered, then the event would have touched people before they could name it. A pale morning can still be morning, but it does not give the same confidence. A cold growing season can still be a season, but it changes the meaning of waiting. The human body is not built like a sealed machine, independent from the world outside. It is porous to weather. It spends energy to stay warm. It depends on food that depends on plants, and plants depend on light, water, temperature, and time. When one link in that chain weakens, the body may not notice the cause, but it notices the cost. Work becomes heavier when food is uncertain. Cold feels sharper when storage is low. Sleep becomes less peaceful when the next day cannot be trusted to bring improvement. The old human mind, shaped across thousands of generations, is especially attentive to patterns that affect survival. A strange sky is not just scenery, it becomes a sign. A weak sun, repeated across days and months, could have trained attention toward worry. People might watch the horizon more closely, compare one morning with another, remember older seasons, ask whether elders had ever seen such light before. None of this requires inventing thoughts for people whose private minds are lost to us. It only follows from the basic fact that human communities had to read the environment to live. Our species became successful by noticing change. A broken pattern in the sky would not remain outside human awareness. It would settle into the practical rhythm of the day. Should work begin early if the air is still cold? Should animals be moved? Should seed be saved or risked? Should grain be eaten now or guarded for a longer hunger? These decisions belong to households more than to chronicles, yet they are where history becomes physical. The great events of the past are often remembered through names and dates, but the body remembers through strain. In 536, the dimness mattered because human beings were still, as they had always been, daylight creatures living inside a climate system they could not command. Their eyes could look up, their hands could work the soil, their fires could push back the night for a few hours. But the larger supply of warmth remained beyond them. That is the quiet vulnerability at the center of this story. Civilization had grown complex, but the body had not escaped its ancient dependence on the returning sun. When light weakens, the body does not understand it as history. It understands it as a change in the conditions of living. The eyes receive less brightness, the skin receives less warmth. The day may still have a beginning and an end, but the body meets it with a smaller promise. For people in the 6th century, this would not have been a matter of comfort alone. A dimmer sky could mean colder air, slower growth, and a longer uncertainty between one meal and the next. The body responds to such uncertainty quietly. It saves energy when food is scarce. It feels labor more heavily when nourishment is poor. It becomes more watchful when ordinary signs fail. Human beings had carried this sensitivity from deep time. Long before fields were planted, our ancestors survived by noticing when light changed, when animals moved, when plants were ready, and when a season was beginning to turn. That older attentiveness did not disappear when people settled in villages or lived near churches, markets, and imperial roads. It remained inside the nervous system, inside hunger, inside sleep, inside the daily judgment of safety. A weak sun would have made that judgment harder. Imagine a morning that comes, but does not lift the cold. The household rises because work must be done, yet the air does not soften as expected. Tools are carried out, animals are checked, fields are watched. Nothing has ended, but everything feels delayed. This is the meaning of waiting under a damaged sky. The body waits for warmth. Seeds wait for soil to change. Leaves wait for enough light to turn their small labor into growth. Children wait for food that depends on harvests they cannot understand. Adults wait for signs that the year is correcting itself. Waiting becomes a form of pressure. It does not always show as panic. Often it appears as carefulness, silence, rationing, and the tightening of ordinary choices. A person may eat a little less so another can eat enough. A family may hold grain back because the next harvest is uncertain. A community may delay decisions because the weather has stopped giving clear instructions. These are not dramatic scenes, but they are deeply human. They belong to the long history of bodies adapting to conditions beyond control. The strange year of 536 matters because it reminds us that climate is not outside the human story. It enters through the need for calories, through the time required for crops, through the strength needed to work, and through the trust required to sleep. Sleep itself depends on safety. Even without modern terms, people knew the difference between resting after a stable day and lying down with worry in the room. If the sun seemed weak for many months, the mind could not easily separate sky from survival. Each pale morning might ask the same quiet question: is the world returning to itself? Or is this the new pattern? The body is built to endure hardship, but endurance has limits. Cold demands fuel. Hunger reduces strength. Uncertainty consumes attention. In a society without electric light, mechanized farming, or global food transport, the margin between a difficult season and a dangerous season could be narrow. Yet the people of 536 were not helpless shadows waiting for disaster. They had knowledge, storage, customs, neighbors, animals, tools, and memory. They had ways of reading the land that modern people often forget. Still, even the most experienced community could not command the upper atmosphere. That is the quiet center of this moment. Human skill was real, but the scale of the disturbance was larger than any village. The body could adapt, but it could not make the sun warmer. It could wait, work, ration, pray, travel, trade, and endure. What it could not do was restore the old certainty that morning light would be enough. A change in the sky becomes serious when it stops being only a change in what people see and begins to change what their bodies can do. The body does not live on light directly, but almost everything that keeps the body alive is connected to light by a chain of dependence. Sunlight warms soil. Warm soil helps seeds open. Growing plants become grain, fruit, leaves, roots, fodder, and fuel for animals. Animals become milk, meat, labor, wool, leather, movement, and storage of energy on legs. Wood dries in seasons shaped by heat. Rivers, roads, and fields are used according to weather. When sunlight seems weak for too long, the first human feeling may be confusion, but the later human cost is practical. A dim sky can become an empty granary. A cold season can become a thinner animal. A failed harvest can become a tired body that cannot work as before. This is why the events around 536 cannot be understood only as a strange visual episode. They belong to the deeper history of human dependence on the living world. Our species began as part of that world, not above it. The earliest humans did not separate environment from body. A dry season was hunger. A cold night was danger. A rich landscape was possibility. A river, a herd, a stand of trees, or a patch of edible plants could decide whether a group moved, stayed, grew, or declined. Agriculture changed the form of that dependence, but not the dependence itself. By the 6th century, people had fields, barns, taxes, trade routes, ships, cities, monasteries, laws, and armies. Yet each of those structures still rested on calories. A city could look powerful from a distance, with walls and churches and markets, but it remained vulnerable to what happened in the fields beyond its gates. If the sky reduced growth, the city would eventually feel it in prices, hunger, movement, disease risk, and fear. The body is where these large patterns become intimate. A person who eats less for several weeks does not experience climate instability as an idea. They experience weakness in the arms, slower walking, colder nights, shorter patience, and greater attention to food. A parent watching stored grain decline does not need a theory of volcanic aerosols to understand danger. A farmer seeing plants fail to ripen does not need a modern chart to know that the future is narrowing, and when the future narrows, sleep changes. Sleep is one of the quietest measures of human safety. It comes more easily when the body believes tomorrow can be met. It becomes lighter when danger, hunger, or uncertainty remains close. In a world without artificial brightness, sleep also belonged closely to the sky. Evening darkness gathered people inward. Morning light released them outward. If daylight itself seemed weakened, the rhythm of rest and work may have felt less secure. not because people understood every cause, but because the normal pattern no longer carried the same assurance. This does not mean every person suffered in the same way. Some regions may have been affected more than others. Some households had more stores, stronger animals, better land, wider kinship ties, or access to trade. Some communities may have remembered earlier hard years and used older habits of survival. History is never a single feeling shared equally by all. But a prolonged disturbance in light and temperature could press most heavily on those whose margins were already thin. Children, the elderly, the poor, isolated households, and people dependent on local harvests would have had fewer ways to absorb the shock. Here the story returns again to the ancient beginning of human life. Human beings survived not by being invulnerable, but by being responsive. We read signs, share food, remember seasons, adjust movement, and build meaning around uncertainty. The dimming of 536 tested that responsiveness at a scale no ordinary household could see. The danger was not only that the sun looked strange. The danger was that the strange sky entered the chain of life beneath it, passing from air to plant, from plant to storehouse, from storehouse to muscle, from muscle to work, and from work to the fragile calm that allows a human being to sleep. The sky was far above them, but its consequences came all the way down to the body. A field is a quiet agreement between sunlight, soil, water, seed, and time. Human beings can clear land, choose grain, guide irrigation, store tools, and remember the right season to plant, but they cannot make a crop grow by will alone. The plant must do its own ancient work, turning light into living matter, drawing from earth and air, building stem, leaf, root, and seed, slowly enough that the process can seem almost invisible. For most of human existence, before cities and written law, people lived by gathering what the landscape produced on its own. Later, with farming, they changed the relationship. They began to ask the land to produce more predictably, in one place, for larger communities, through repeated seasons. But this was not freedom from nature. It was a deeper negotiation with nature. Farming made food more abundant in good years, yet it also tied human survival to the success of particular plants in particular fields. By 536, many societies had lived for centuries with this dependence. Their calendars, taxes, rents, prayers, markets, and family duties were organized around the harvest. Grain was not simply food. It was stored sunlight, turned into something that could be counted, carried, ground, baked, traded, taxed, and saved for winter. When the sky dimmed and warmth weakened, that stored sunlight became harder to make. A farmer did not need modern biology to know that crops require a season that holds together. Seeds may sprout in cool soil, but they need enough warmth to strengthen. Leaves may appear, but they need light to build substance. Grain may form, but it needs time to ripen before cold, rain, frost, or rot can damage it. A year can fail not because every plant dies at once, but because growth is delayed at the wrong moment. The field becomes late, the harvest becomes thin. The straw may stand, but the grain may be poor. The plant may live, yet fail to give enough back to the people waiting for it. This is where the strange sky of 536 becomes more than a memory of dim daylight. It becomes a problem of calories. A weak harvest could ripple outward through human life. Less grain meant less bread. Less fodder meant weaker animals. Weaker animals meant less traction for ploughing, less manure for fields, less milk, and less resilience in the next season. A poor harvest could therefore wound not only the present year but the year after it. Agriculture is built on continuity. Seed must be saved from one harvest to begin another. Animals must survive winter to work spring land. Families must have enough strength to labor when the weather allows. If one link breaks, the others tighten. The human body, which began its story in landscapes of hunting, gathering, hunger, movement, and adaptation, was still living inside that chain. Civilization had not changed the fact that a person without food becomes weaker, slower, colder, and more vulnerable. It had only made the chain more complex. In a small community, people may have known the look of a poor crop before the harvest was finished. They would see the height of the plants, the color of the leaves, the fullness of the heads, the condition of fruit, the behavior of animals on thin pasture. The sky would be watched not as a distant wonder, but as a daily measure of hope. If the light remained pale, each day could feel like another delay in the field's promise. The danger was not only famine in the dramatic sense. It was the slow shrinking of expectation, less to store, less to trade, less to share, less to risk, less to carry into winter. A society can endure one difficult field, one unlucky household, one cold valley. It is harder when many fields begin to answer the sky in the same uncertain way. In 536, the dimming mattered because human communities were living on the edge between memory and dependence. They remembered how seasons should behave, and they depended on that behavior to turn soil into food. When the sun seemed weakened, the field became the place where the sky's mystery entered human life, quietly, leaf by leaf, seed by seed, until the question above became a question inside every storehouse. A cold summer is dangerous because it arrives under the name of a season that people expect to be generous. Winter is understood as hardship. Early spring is understood as uncertainty. But summer is supposed to be the time when the year repairs the hunger of the cold months. It is the season when light stays longer, soil holds warmth, plants thicken, animals graze, and human beings begin to believe that storage will be possible again. When summer itself fails to behave like summer, the problem reaches deeper than discomfort. It interrupts the part of the year that is meant to restore the body and prepare the household for what comes next. In the world around 536, this mattered with a force that modern life can easily underestimate. Many communities did not live with large reserves far beyond their own region. Some trade existed, and in certain empires it could be wide and organized, but food still came from real fields, real animals, real weather, and real labor. A cold growing season could make that whole arrangement fragile. Grain might grow slowly, fruit might not ripen fully, vines might suffer. Pasture might remain thin. If rain, cold, and dim light came together, drying and storing food could become harder as well. The danger was not always the complete destruction of crops. Often, the more frightening danger was a harvest that looked like a harvest from a distance, but gave back too little when measured, ground, cooked, or saved. A field could stand and still fail the people who depended on it. This is how hunger often begins in history, not with empty land, but with land that gives less than expected. A household may first reduce what it eats. Then, it may use seed grain, which protects the present but endangers the future. Then animals may be slaughtered earlier than planned, or sold, or left weaker through lack of fodder. Each decision solves one problem while making another more likely. The next planting season begins with fewer reserves, fewer strong animals, less confidence, and more fear. One bad summer can therefore stretch beyond its own months. It can move forward in time through weakened bodies and reduced stores. That is why the cold years around the mid-6th century belong not only to weather history, but to the long human story of risk, memory, and survival. Our earliest ancestors did not farm, but they knew the meaning of seasonal failure. A landscape that usually offered food could become sparse. Animals could migrate differently. Plants could fruit late or not at all. Human groups survived by moving, adjusting, sharing, remembering, and reading signs. Farming changed the tools of survival, yet it also narrowed some choices. A farmer cannot always move away from a failed field. A village cannot easily carry its soil somewhere else. A city cannot feed itself from its streets. Agriculture made people powerful in one sense, because it allowed population, settlement, craft, writing, and state power to grow. But it also made society dependent on repeated success. The granary became a place where the sky, the field, and the future met. If that granary filled poorly, everything above it became less stable. Taxes became harder to collect. Rents became heavier to pay. Markets became sharper places. Families had to decide what could be spared and what had to be protected. Those decisions may not appear in grand histories, but they are the hidden structure beneath many historical changes. In a year of cold summer, the body feels what the state later records as shortage. The child feels it as a smaller meal. The worker feels it as weakness before the day is finished. The elder feels it as cold that reaches deeper because there is less food to burn inside the body. The farmer feels it in the hand when grain is lighter than it should be. None of these experiences proves that every region suffered equally in 536. The evidence does not require such a simple picture. Some places may have been hit harder by cold, dimness, rain, or failed growth. Others may have been partly protected by local climate, stored food, trade routes, or different crops. But the basic mechanism is clear enough to treat seriously. When a large atmospheric disturbance reduces warmth and light, societies built on seasonal agriculture can become vulnerable. The sky does not need to destroy every harvest to change history. It only needs to reduce enough harvests, in enough places, for enough time, until normal reserves no longer feel normal. A cold summer is therefore a quiet form of disorder. It leaves no crater in the field. It does not announce itself as a single disaster. It simply makes the season of growth less able to grow. And for human beings, whose bodies still depend on ancient chains linking sunlight to food, that failure can travel slowly, from the air into the soil, from the soil into the crop, from the crop into the storehouse, and from the storehouse into the fragile strength of a family waiting for winter. Hunger rarely enters history as a single moment. It usually arrives by subtraction. First there is a little less grain than expected, then a little less flour, then bread is cut thinner, animals are guarded more carefully, seed is watched with anxiety, and every meal begins to carry the shadow of another meal that may not come. This is why the world of 536 should not be imagined only through a darkened sky. The sky was the beginning of the disturbance, but hunger would have moved at ground level, through hands, bowls, barns, fields, and bodies. A person might not wake one morning and say that a catastrophe had arrived. They might simply notice that the stored food was being used too quickly, that the weather had not improved, that neighbours spoke more quietly about the harvest, that animals looked leaner, that children asked for food before the next portion could be spared. The danger grew because it was slow enough to become daily life. Human beings are able to endure short hardship with remarkable strength. Our species carries a long memory of scarcity, even if not in words. Before farming, people faced seasons when food was difficult to find, when animals moved away, when fruiting plants failed, when cold or drought changed the landscape. Survival depended on attention, cooperation, movement, and restraint. Farming did not remove that older vulnerability. It placed it inside storage systems, planting cycles, property, taxes, and settlement. In a farming society, hunger can begin long before the last storehouse is empty. It begins when people must choose between eating seed grain and saving it for planting. It begins when a family kills an animal that was meant to pull a plough or give milk. It begins when the old eat less so the young can continue. It begins when people sell tools, leave land, delay marriage, postpone repairs, or travel in search of work, food, or kin. These decisions are rarely dramatic when seen one by one, but together they show how a climate shock becomes a social wound. A dim, cold year presses first on plants, then on reserves, then on choices, then on relationships. The body registers each stage with quiet precision. Hunger makes work heavier. Cold feels deeper when the body has less fuel. Illness becomes harder to resist when strength has been spent. Sleep becomes thinner when the mind keeps counting what remains. In this way, the story returns again to the beginning of human life under uncertain skies. The human body was shaped to survive variation, but not without cost. It can slow down, conserve energy, endure discomfort, and wait for better conditions. Yet waiting itself consumes life when food is uncertain. A week of poor meals can be borne. Many weeks begin to change the way a person moves through the day. A season of poor food can alter births, deaths, movement, labour, and memory. This is why historians and scientists treat the mid-6th century climate disturbance as more than an unusual weather story. It touched the systems that carried life forward from one generation to the next. No careful account should claim that every village suffered in the same way, or that every later crisis came directly from the dimming of 536. History is never that simple. Local land, stored food, trade routes, political strength, disease, war, and social structure all shaped what people experienced. But it is reasonable to say that poor light and cold could make existing weakness more dangerous. A community already near the edge might be pushed closer to loss. A household with little reserve might cross from difficulty into hunger. A region dependent on a fragile crop might find that one failed season was not an isolated problem, but the beginning of a longer strain. The most frightening thing about this kind of hunger is that it does not need to announce itself. It enters through the ordinary. It is present in a smaller loaf, a delayed planting, a thin animal, a silent parent, a field watched too often, a night when the wind sounds colder because the body has eaten less. The sun above may still rise, but the promise carried by that light has weakened. In 536, if daylight no longer gave full warmth and summer no longer gave full growth, then hunger would not have been only an event. It would have been a slow narrowing of possibility, moving from the sky into the soil, from the soil into food, and from food into the human future. Long after a human witness is gone, a tree may still hold the shape of the year it survived. It does not remember with language, it does not explain fear, hunger, harvest, or cold. It simply grows when conditions allow growth, and it slows when the world gives less. This is why trees have become some of the quietest witnesses to the strange climate years around 536. A written chronicle can tell us that the sun seemed dim, that the air felt wrong, that crops failed, or that people suffered. A tree tells the story differently. It records the year inside its wood. In a favourable season, when warmth, light, water, and time come together, a tree can add a wider ring. In a difficult season, the ring may become narrow, dense, or altered. The tree does not know history, but it stands inside climate. Its body is made by the same conditions that shape fields, pastures, rivers, and human food. When scientists later study old wood, they are not reading emotion, they are reading growth. Around the middle of the 6th century, tree ring evidence from some regions points toward unusually poor growth, a signal consistent with severe cold or difficult growing conditions. That does not mean every tree everywhere suffered in the same way. Trees are local beings. A tree on a mountain, a tree near a river, a tree in a dry region, and a tree in a cold northern landscape do not respond identically. But when many records from different places begin to show stress around the same period, they add weight to the idea that something larger than local weather was happening. This matters because human memory can be uneven. A chronicler may exaggerate, misunderstand, borrow older language, or write with religious and political meanings in mind. A tree has its own limitations, but it does not write for persuasion. It simply carries the cost of the year in its structure. For the story of 536, that cost is important. It helps us move from the feeling of a dim sun to the material world beneath it. If light and warmth were reduced, trees would not be the only living things affected. Crops, grasses, fruiting plants, and forest growth would all be part of the same living system, though each in its own way. The ring of a tree is therefore not only about the tree, it is a sign of the season that also surrounded human bodies. The ancestors of human beings, long before farming, lived by watching such signs directly. They did not measure rings with microscopes, but they knew the meaning of poor growth, late fruit, thin vegetation, and altered animal behavior. They read landscapes as carefully as later scholars read archives. That deep human skill was born from necessity. A landscape that produced less food could change movement, cooperation, birth, death, and memory. By 536, people had entered a more complex world of villages, cities, churches, states, and trade, yet the biological foundation remained the same. If plants grew poorly, human life became more difficult. Tree rings remind us of this foundation. They bring the event back to the slow work of living tissue. A dim sky is not just an image above the head. It is a condition that can enter wood, grain, pasture, and bone through the chain of growth and nourishment. This is also why the evidence must be handled with care. A narrow ring does not speak a full sentence by itself. It must be compared with other rings, other regions, ice evidence, written records, and climate understanding. One tree cannot prove a world event. One region cannot explain the whole earth. But many trees, studied together, can show when growth became unusually difficult across wide areas. They can reveal a pattern too large to belong to one storm or one valley. In that sense, trees do not replace human witnesses. They steady them. They give the old written reports a second kind of body. A person in 536 could look up and say the sun seemed weak. A tree, growing through that same season, could silently make less wood. Centuries later, those two witnesses meet. The human voice that remembered dimness, and the wooden record that preserved poor growth. Together, they bring us closer to the truth without pretending to close every gap. They show that the year was not only strange in words, it was difficult in the living world itself, and for human beings, whose long beginning was shaped by the need to read trees, plants, seasons, and hunger, that silent evidence matters deeply. It tells us that the mystery of the sky was also written into the earth, one narrow ring at a time. Ice keeps a different kind of memory from wood. A tree records the difficulty of a year through growth, but ice records what fell out of the sky and became sealed in layers. In the cold places of the world, snow can survive summer, become buried by later snow, and slowly turn into ice. Layer by layer, it holds tiny traces of atmosphere, dust, ash, and chemicals carried by winds long after the people who breathe that air have disappeared. When scientists drill into ice sheets and glaciers, they are not opening a written archive, yet they are still entering a record of time. Each layer can belong to a season or a year. Each impurity can become a clue. For the mystery of 536, one of the most important clues is sulfate. Large volcanic eruptions can send sulfur gases high into the atmosphere. There, chemical reactions can form sulfate particles, which reflect some sunlight and can cool the surface below. Eventually, some of that material falls back to Earth and may become trapped in ice. This does not mean every sulfate layer has the same meaning, or that ice alone tells the whole story. But when a strong sulfate signal appears near a period already known from tree rings and written accounts as unusually cold and dim, the pieces begin to speak to one another. The human witness says the sun seemed weak. The tree says growth was poor. The ice says something volcanic may have entered the high air. Together, they make the volcanic explanation difficult to ignore. This is why modern research often connects the dimming around 536 with one or more major eruptions. The idea is not that people saw a volcano everywhere, or that one visible mountain frightened the whole world. The deeper idea is more unsettling. A violent event in one place may have changed the sky over many other places, including places where no one knew the source. A farmer could stand in a field far from any eruption and still live under its atmospheric consequences. A child could feel a colder season without ever seeing the mountain that helped cause it. This distance between cause and experience is one of the important truths in the story. Human beings evolved to read local signs, the color of plants, the movement of animals, the smell of rain, frost, and the length of daylight. Those skills were powerful at the scale of a valley, a forest, a river, or a coast. But the upper atmosphere is larger than any ancient community could observe. It can carry material across boundaries that human beings would later call kingdoms, languages, and empires. The body feels the result, while the cause remains invisible. Ice helps close that distance, not by giving a complete answer, but by showing that the sky itself had a chemical history. Still, care is necessary. Dating ice layers is complex. Signals can be compared and corrected, but they are not simple labels placed neatly on the past. Different ice cores may preserve different details. Scientists continue to discuss the source region, the number of eruptions involved, and how the effects varied from place to place. The most honest statement is not that the mystery has vanished. It is that the mystery has become more precise. We are no longer facing only a strange sentence in an old chronicle. We are looking at a convergence of evidence. Dim sunlight remembered by writers, poor growth recorded in wood, and sulfate preserved in ice. That convergence points strongly toward volcanic material in the atmosphere as a major cause of the dimming and cooling. Yet it does not allow every human consequence to be described with certainty. Ice can tell us that something entered the air. It cannot tell us exactly how each village slept, worried, rationed, planted, or mourned. The ice gives the sky a traceable body. It turns invisible haze into something measurable, But it also reminds us how small human beings are beneath the systems that sustain them. In 536, the source of trouble may have been far away, but the effect came near, falling eventually into ice, fields, food, and memory. The evidence for 536 is strongest when it is allowed to remain layered. No single witness carries the whole weight. A chronicler can preserve the feeling of a strange sky, but not measure the chemistry of the air. A tree can preserve the stress of a difficult growing season, but not explain why the light weakened. Ice can preserve sulfate from volcanic material, but not describe the hunger of a household or the fear inside a village. Each record is incomplete by itself. Together, they create a more careful picture. Around 536, something large disturbed the atmosphere. Sunlight appears to have been reduced in many places. Temperatures likely fell, and living systems felt the pressure. That is what can be said with some confidence. But confidence is not the same as certainty about every detail. The exact source of the disturbance, the number of eruptions involved, the timing across regions, and the local human effects remain subjects of study. This distinction matters deeply because the year 536 attracts dramatic language. It is easy to turn a pale sun into a total darkness, a cold year into a universal collapse, or a scientific question into a mystery that sounds larger than the evidence allows. Yet the real story does not become weaker when told carefully. It becomes more human. The most frightening part is not that the sun literally disappeared. It is that ordinary people may have lived through months when daylight no longer gave the reassurance it had given to every generation before them. The cause was likely high above them, carried in air they could not see and could not understand. But the result entered the small spaces of life. The field, the storehouse, the hearth, the sleeping place, the body. Science can now follow some of those traces backward. Sulfate in ice points toward volcanic activity. Narrow tree rings point toward difficult growth. Written reports point toward dimness, cold, and disorder in the seasons. These forms of evidence do not speak in the same language, but they do not need to. Their value is in convergence. When different records, created by different processes, lean in the same direction, the outline of the past becomes clearer. Still, an outline is not a complete map. A volcanic eruption can affect climate, but climate effects are shaped by latitude, season, wind patterns, ocean conditions, crop types, stored food, and social systems. A cold year in one region may mean crop failure. In another, it may mean hardship but not collapse. In a third, it may be remembered only faintly or not at all. Human history is uneven because human vulnerability is uneven. The same sky can fall differently on a wealthy city, a mountain village, a coastal trading town, and a poor farming household. This is why the story must resist a single simple conclusion. The evidence supports a major atmospheric disturbance, probably volcanic in nature. It does not support pretending that we know every face, every field, every death, or every decision that followed. The people who lived through 536 did not leave us enough to reconstruct their inner lives, and it would be dishonest to invent them. What we can do is understand the conditions around them. We can understand that human bodies depend on food, that food depends on growing seasons, that growing seasons depend on sunlight and warmth, and that even complex societies remain tied to those ancient chains. This returns the mystery to the beginning of our species. Human beings became human under skies they could not command. We learned to read signs, cooperate through scarcity, store memory, and make meaning when the world became uncertain. The evidence from 536 shows that this old relationship did not vanish when empires rose. It remained underneath everything. A court could issue laws, a church could hold prayers, a market could set prices, and a family could ration grain, but none of them could clear the upper atmosphere by desire. The honest lesson of the evidence is therefore not only about volcanoes or cold summers, it is about scale. Human life takes place at the level of hands, meals, sleep, and seasons. While some causes move at the scale of oceans, winds, ice, and sky, the past becomes truthful when we keep both scales together. We know enough to see that 536 was not just a legend of darkness. We do not know enough to turn it into a finished explanation with every uncertainty removed. Between those two facts lies the real weight of the year, a world where the light changed, life responded, and the full reason remained partly beyond human sight. A volcano can change the sky without being seen by most of the people who live under its shadow. This is one of the quiet terrors of the year 536. The danger did not have to arrive as falling fire in every place, or ash covering every roof, or a mountain exploding before every witness. A major eruption could happen far away, perhaps beyond the knowledge of the people whose crops later struggled beneath a pale sun. What matters is not only the violence at the mountain, but what the eruption sends upward. When a very large volcano releases gases and fine material high enough into the atmosphere, some of that material can travel far from the source. Sulfur gases can form tiny sulfate particles, and those particles can reflect part of the sun's energy back towards space. The effect is not the same as night. It is not a curtain that makes the world black. It is more like a thinning of the sun's gift, a soft but widespread reduction in the warmth and brightness that usually reach the ground. For human beings, the difference between full sunlight and weakened sunlight can become the difference between abundance and anxiety. The people of the 6th century would not have described it in chemical terms. They would have known it through consequences. The sky looked wrong, the sun seemed weak, the season did not behave as expected, the air held a chill that felt out of place. In this way, a volcano can become a disaster of distance. The eruption belongs to one location, but the atmosphere carries its effects across lands and seas. A village that never hears the eruption can still live inside its aftermath. A field that never receives visible ash can still receive less warmth. A child born far from the volcano can still enter a year when food becomes harder to secure. This is why the volcanic explanation is so powerful for 536. It connects the local experience of dim light with a planetary system larger than any ancient observer could understand. Human beings evolved to read nearby signs. Our ancestors watched clouds, animal tracks, fruiting plants, water, wind, and the behavior of fire. These were signs that could be seen, smelled, touched, and remembered. But the upper atmosphere is not a forest path or a riverbank. It is a vast moving layer, capable of carrying tiny particles beyond the reach of ordinary sight. The body still feels the result, even when the mind cannot locate the cause. A farmer could look upward and see only a weak disk of light, not the invisible particles scattering sunlight above him. A mother could notice cold in the house, not the chemical trail of a distant eruption. A ruler could worry about grain, taxes, and unrest, not the precise path of sulfate through the sky. Modern science helps us name the hidden mechanism, but it should not make us forget how mysterious it must have felt from below. The strength of a large eruption lies partly in timing. If material reaches high air and remains there long enough, it can affect more than one day or 1 week. It can disturb the season of growth. It can reduce the warmth needed for crops at the exact time when fields are meant to build the food of the coming year. This is where the story moves from geology into human life. A volcano is a mountain event, but hunger is a body event. Between them stands the atmosphere, carrying cause into consequence. The light changes first, then the soil warms less, then plants grow more slowly, then harvests become uncertain, then stores become guarded, then families feel the pressure in meals, labour, sleep and fear. The chain is long, but it is not imaginary. It is the same chain that has tied human survival to climate since the beginning of our species. We became human under skies that gave and withheld. We learned to live with seasons, but not to command them. In 536, if volcanic material truly dimmed the sun across wide regions, then the old dependence was exposed again. The mountain may have been distant, the cause may have been hidden, yet the result came close enough to enter fields, houses and bodies. The sun did not need to disappear for the world to become uncertain. It only needed to be weakened long enough for people to wonder whether the season they trusted would still feed them. One of the hardest truths in the story of 536 is that distance does not always protect a human community from a natural event. A village may be far from a volcano. A field may lie beyond mountains, seas and kingdoms. A family may never hear a roar, never see lava, never find ash falling thickly on the roof. Yet the atmosphere does not respect the distances that human beings feel in daily life. Air moves over borders. Winds carry what eyes cannot follow. The upper sky can become a road for particles so small that no person standing below could understand why the light has changed. This is why a volcanic disturbance can be so different from a local disaster. A flood is usually known by water that reaches the feet. A fire is known by heat and smoke nearby. A storm is known by sound, wind, and rain. But a great eruption can send its consequences into regions where the mountain itself is absent from memory. The cause remains hidden, while the effects become intimate. In the 6th century, this hidden distance would have shaped the way people experienced the dimming. They could look up and see a strange sun, but they could not look far enough to see the source. They could feel cold in a season that should have warmed them, but they could not trace that cold back through currents of air, chemical particles, and high-altitude circulation. For them, the world may have seemed disordered from above without explanation from below. That is an important difference. A disaster with a visible source can be feared, named, and sometimes avoided. A disaster carried by the atmosphere surrounds people before they know what it is. It turns the familiar sky into the messenger of something remote. This matters because human beings evolved in close contact with local environments. Our older skills were built around what could be observed at human scale. A footprint in mud, a cloud over hills, a change in wind, the smell of rain, the silence of animals, the ripening of fruit, the cooling of evening. These were signs a body could learn. They belonged to the range of eyes, ears, skin, and memory. But volcanic haze in the upper atmosphere belongs to a different scale. It can be produced by one event and spread across distances so wide that no single ancient observer could connect the beginning with the end. A person could experience the consequence without ever having access to the cause. This gap between cause and experience is central to the mystery of 536. It helps explain why later evidence is needed. Written records preserve the dim light. Trees preserve the poor growth. Ice preserves the chemical trace. But no single witness on the ground could have seen the entire chain. The sky itself was the carrier. If sulfate particles spread high above the weather systems people knew, they could reflect sunlight before it fully reached the land. The result at ground level could be subtle day by day, yet serious over time. A slightly weaker sun may not sound catastrophic when imagined for an afternoon, but over weeks and months, less warmth can delay growth, weaken harvests, and make the body spend more energy against cold. The danger lies in duration. The atmosphere can turn one violent eruption into a long, quiet pressure placed on people who had no connection to the mountain. A farmer in one region might blame a poor season on local weather. A monk might record a strange sun as a sign of disorder. A family might simply ration food without ever knowing that the origin of their difficulty may have been far away. History often looks different when seen from above than when lived from within. From above, modern science can describe circulation, particles, cooling, and climate response. From within, human beings experienced waiting, uncertainty, weak light, poor growth, and difficult choices. Both views are necessary, but they are not the same. The ancient human body did not live in diagrams. It lived in fields and rooms, in hunger and cold, in labour and sleep. This is where the distance of the volcano becomes almost intimate. A remote eruption could reach a person not by touch, but by altering the conditions that made touch, work, warmth, and food possible. It could enter the body through less bread, colder nights, weaker animals, and heavier labour. Civilization had created roads, governments, trade, armies, and cities, but the atmosphere remained above them all. A border could stop a soldier, a wall could slow an enemy, a law could order attacks, but none of these could command the high sky to clear. The people of 536 were living inside a truth that reaches back to the origin of humanity. We are local creatures inside planetary systems. We make homes in valleys, coasts, forests, plains, and towns, yet the air above us joins those places together. A mountain far away can become a season nearby. A hidden cloud can become a smaller harvest. A change in the upper atmosphere can descend into the smallest human spaces, where food is counted, children are warmed, and sleep comes only when tomorrow still feels possible. The volcanic explanation gives the year 536 a strong outline, but not a finished map. It tells us that material high in the atmosphere could have dimmed sunlight and cooled the surface. It helps connect old descriptions of a weak sun with tree growth and chemical traces in ice. Yet it does not answer every careful question. Where exactly did the main eruption happen? Was there one eruption, or more than one close together? How much of the dimming came from a single source, and how much from a sequence of disturbances? Which regions suffered most, and which were partly protected by local climate, crops, storage, or trade? These questions matter because the past becomes distorted when uncertainty is treated as emptiness. To say that not everything is known is not the same as saying nothing is known. The evidence points strongly toward volcanic activity, but the details remain difficult because the event was spread across systems larger than any single archive. A volcano leaves traces in air, ice, trees, sediments, and sometimes in human memory, but those traces do not always line up like pages in a book. Winds move unevenly. Ice layers must be dated with care. Trees respond to local conditions as well as wider climate. Chronicles were written by people with their own language, fears, beliefs, and purposes. The work of understanding 536 is therefore not the work of finding one dramatic sentence and making it explain the world. It is the slower work of placing different kinds of evidence beside one another and asking where they agree, where they remain silent, and where they warn us to be cautious. This caution is important because climate does not strike all people in the same way. A colder summer in one region might mean a failed crop. In another, it might mean only a reduced harvest. In another, the effect might be softened by fishing, stored food, trade, or a crop better suited to cold. Some communities may have suffered sharply, while others may have noticed the strange sky without reaching the same level of hunger. The atmosphere can spread a disturbance widely, but human consequences are always filtered through local life. Land, wealth, storage, labor, politics, disease, and social ties all shape how a natural event becomes a human crisis. This is one reason the story returns again to the deep origin of human beings. Our ancestors survived not by facing one universal environment, but by adapting to many different landscapes. Plains, coasts, forests, mountains, deserts, and river valleys each demanded different knowledge. The same weather could be danger in one place and inconvenience in another. That unevenness did not disappear with farming or empires. It remained within every community. In 536, the sky may have been widely altered, but the ground beneath it was never the same everywhere. A family with grain stored from earlier years faced a different future from a family already near hunger. A coastal settlement with fish faced a different problem from an inland village dependent on one harvest. A powerful state could try to move food or organize relief, while a small isolated settlement might endure alone. These differences do not weaken the seriousness of the event, they make it more real. History is not a flat surface. It is a landscape of unequal exposure. The unresolved questions around the eruption also protect the story from becoming too simple. If we pretend to know the exact source, the exact spread, and the exact suffering of every region, we lose the humility that the evidence itself teaches. The mystery of 536 is not an empty mystery. It is a shaped mystery, bordered by records, rings, ice, and climate understanding. We can see that the sun's strength was likely reduced by something placed high in the air. We can see that living systems responded. We can see that human beings, still dependent on light and warmth, were vulnerable to changes they could not command. But the final details remain partly hidden, like the volcano itself for those who suffered far away. That hiddenness is not a failure of the story. It is part of the truth. The year 536 reminds us that human life often unfolds between what can be felt clearly and what can only be understood much later. The world of 536 was not an empty stage waiting for a disaster to give it meaning. It was already crowded with people, memories, borders, ambitions, debts, harvests, armies, roads, ports, and prayers. The dimming of the sun did not fall on silence. It fell on societies that were already moving, already strained in some places, already resilient in others, and already dependent on the regular return of seasons. In the Eastern Mediterranean, the Roman Empire still continued in its eastern form, centered on Constantinople, with officials, soldiers, taxes, churches, laws, and trade routes reaching across sea and land. Its power was real, but it was not free from the limits that all human systems share. Grain still had to grow somewhere. Ships still had to sail through weather. Soldiers still had to eat. Cities still depended on countryside. A state could organize movement, record orders, and claim authority, but it could not create sunlight. Farther west, many regions that had once been under Western Roman control were governed by successor kingdoms, local elites, bishops, landowners, and communities trying to maintain order in a changing political world. These places were not simply ruins. They were living societies, with farms, markets, families, and traditions. But many of them carried the aftershocks of earlier centuries, shifting power, changing trade, local warfare, and different forms of authority replacing older imperial structures. To the east, the Sasanian Persian Empire stood as a major power, with its own administration, armies, religion, cities, and agricultural heartlands. Beyond these large states were many other communities across Europe, Africa, Asia, and the wider world, each with its own ways of farming, herding, trading, storing food, and understanding the sky. This matters because the year 536 cannot be told as if one event struck one single humanity in one single way. Human beings shared the same need for light, warmth, food, and sleep, but they did not share the same protections. The same dim sky could meet very different conditions on the ground. A coastal trading city might draw food from several regions if ships could still move and markets still functioned. A mountain village might depend more tightly on a short growing season and a narrow range of crops. A pastoral community might feel pressure through pasture and animal health before grain stores became the main concern. A wealthy landowner and a poor labourer could live under the same pale sun but face very different margins of survival. History becomes more truthful when these differences are kept visible. The disturbance of 536 entered a world that was already uneven, and unevenness decides how suffering spreads. This returns the story to the beginning of human life. From the earliest generations, human survival was never just a matter of the weather itself, but of the relationship between weather and the way a group lived. A cold year means one thing to people who can move toward food, another to people tied to fields, another to people with stored grain, another to people already weakened by conflict or poverty. Our species survived by adapting to many environments, and that variety continued into historical societies. In 536, the atmosphere may have placed a broad pressure on the world, but the response was local, social, and deeply human. A ruler in Constantinople might see climate stress through the language of tax, supply, military planning, and public order. A monk might record it as a sign of disorder in creation. A farmer might know it through weak warmth on the soil. A child might know only that meals were smaller or the cold lasted longer. None of these perspectives alone is the full truth, but each belongs to it. The sun's dimming was not an isolated spectacle above the earth. It interacted with the actual structures people had built below it. Empires required surplus. Armies required transport. Cities required predictable supply. Religion offered meaning, but meaning did not fill granaries by itself. Trade could soften local failure, but only if enough food existed elsewhere and routes remained open. Local memory could help communities endure, but memory could not lengthen the growing season. The 6th century world was therefore both complex and fragile. Its complexity gave people tools, roads, storage, administration, exchange, law, and shared belief. Its fragility remained in the older fact that all these tools rested on the living earth. When the sky weakened, it did not erase the world's societies. It tested the foundations beneath them. It asked silently how much strain each system could carry before ordinary life became harder to hold together. That is why the story must slow down here. The dim sun of 536 did not descend upon a blank world. It touched a world already full of history, and every society received it through the shape of its own strengths and its own wounds. A climate disturbance does not move through history like an army. With one road and one target, it spreads through air, water, soil, crops, animals, bodies, markets, and memory, and each place receives it through its own conditions. This is why the dimming of 536 must be understood as a pressure rather than a single blow. The same weakened sunlight could mean different things in different landscapes. In one region, a short growing season might become dangerously shorter. In another, stored food might soften the impact. In one valley, cold rain might damage grain. In another place, fishing, herding, or trade might provide some protection. The sky may have been widely altered, but the ground beneath it was never uniform. Human beings have always lived inside this unevenness. From the beginning of our species, survival depended not only on whether the world became cold, dry, wet, or fertile, but on how each group was positioned when the change arrived. A group with mobility faced hardship differently from a group tied to fields. A group with strong kinship networks faced hunger differently from a group isolated by distance or conflict. A society with grain reserves, roads, boats, and administrative memory had tools that a poor village might not possess. Yet tools are not guarantees. They only change the shape of vulnerability. In 536, a community already weakened by war, debt, poor harvests, political conflict, disease, or social inequality would have met the strange sky with fewer reserves. The disturbance did not need to create every crisis from nothing. It could make existing tensions heavier. A cold season becomes more dangerous when storage is already low. A poor harvest becomes more frightening when taxes still need to be paid. A thin pasture becomes more serious when animals are already few. A hungry household becomes more vulnerable when there are no relatives nearby who can help. This is the way climate often enters human history. It does not always overturn a society by itself. More often, it presses on the weak points that are already there. A powerful city may appear stable because its walls still stand, its officials still write, and its markets still open. But if the countryside produces less food, that stability begins to depend on reserves, transport, trust, and force. The city is not fed by its stones. It is fed by fields it may not see. If those fields are under strain, the strain can arrive later as higher prices, migration, unrest, or fear. A village, by contrast, may feel the problem sooner and more directly. The crop is visible, the animals are known, the storage is counted by hand. When the sky is wrong, the village has fewer layers between climate and stomach. Yet even there, not all households stand in the same place. Some have more land, better soil, more animals, stronger family ties, or older stores. Others live much closer to the edge. The same pale sun can therefore become an inconvenience for one person and a threat for another. This unevenness is not a side detail. It is the center of how a natural event becomes human history. The dimming of 536 did not erase local difference. It revealed it. Societies that looked similar from a distance may have responded very differently because their foundations were different. In the Eastern Roman world, state systems could attempt to move resources, command labor, and maintain order, but large systems also carry large demands. Armies need food, cities need supply, officials need revenue. The machinery of government can help coordinate survival, but it can also keep pressure on people when harvests are poor. In smaller or more decentralized regions, local flexibility may have helped some communities adjust. Yet isolation could become dangerous if local food failed. In pastoral areas, the central question might not be grain at first, but pasture, animal health, and movement. In forested or coastal places, alternative foods may have softened the edge of shortage, though never removing dependence on weather completely. Each way of life had its own strength, and each strength had a limit. This returns us to the older story of human adaptation. Our ancestors did not survive because the environment was stable. They survived because they could adjust to change. They moved, shared, learned, remembered, and built social bonds that made danger easier to endure. Agriculture and civilization continued that pattern in new forms. Storage, trade, law, ritual, taxation, markets, and institutions. But every adaptation creates its own dependence. A stored harvest is useful only if earlier harvests were good enough. A trade route helps only if there is food to trade and safety to move it. A state can command only as long as people still have something to give. A community can endure only as long as the body has enough strength to continue. In 536, the dimming sky may have become a test of these dependencies. It did not need to strike every region equally to matter. It only had to press unevenly on a world already full of uneven human arrangements. Some places may have bent and recovered. Others may have carried the damage forward into hunger, movement, conflict, or memory. The truth is not a simple picture of one dark year destroying the world. It is quieter and more serious. A weakened sky met a world that was already complicated, and wherever the foundations were thin, the pressure became harder to bear. A weakened sun can make history harder, but it does not explain history by itself. This is one of the most important cautions in telling the story of 536. When a year becomes famous for darkness, cold, failed crops, and fear, it is tempting to place every later trouble beneath that one shadow. Empires struggle, populations move, diseases spread, wars continue, economies weaken, and the mind wants one clean cause. But human history rarely obeys one cause. It is made from many pressures meeting at once: climate, food, disease, war, trade, belief, leadership, inequality, geography, and chance. The dimming of 536 may have been a serious pressure, perhaps one of the strongest environmental shocks of its time, but it entered a world already in motion. The Eastern Roman Empire was not only dealing with weather. It was managing armies, laws, taxes, borders, religious disputes, cities, and the heavy cost of ambition. The Sasanian world had its own political and military demands. Western Europe contained many local powers, each trying to hold land, loyalty, and food in a changing landscape. Across other regions, communities lived by farming, herding, fishing, trade, and local knowledge, each with its own risks. A cold, dim year could make these systems more fragile, but it did not invent all their fragility. This distinction protects the truth. A bad harvest can deepen debt, but debt may already exist. Hunger can weaken bodies before disease arrives, but disease also has its own roots, hosts, and timing. Poor weather can increase unrest, but unrest also depends on power, trust, force, and memory. A dim sun can reduce confidence, but fear is shaped by culture, religion, and earlier experience. To say that climate mattered is not to say that climate alone decided everything. It means that the environment was one of the large conditions within which human choices became easier or harder. The old story of humanity has always been like this. From the beginning, our species survived through both biology and culture. The body needed warmth, calories, sleep, and safety. The group needed memory, cooperation, tools, and shared meaning. Neither side was complete without the other. A cold landscape did not automatically destroy people. A warm landscape did not automatically save them. Survival depended on how bodies, knowledge, social bonds, and environment met. By 536, the same truth remained, only within larger and more complicated societies. A government might respond to shortage with redistribution, taxation, force, prayer, or neglect. A household might respond by rationing, borrowing, migrating, selling animals, or relying on kin. A community might endure one year and break under the next, not because one cause controlled everything, but because many burdens accumulated. That is why the phrase, "the worst year," must be handled with care. It can help modern listeners feel the severity of the event, but it can also flatten the past. For some people, 536 may have been a year of true suffering. For others, it may have been remembered as strange, cold, or difficult, but not immediately catastrophic. For still others, the larger consequences may have arrived later, through reduced stores, weakened health, social tension, or the compounding of several bad years. History does not always strike in the same month that the sky changes. Sometimes the effect moves forward quietly, carried in hunger, debt, reduced births, illness, migration, and memory. The dimming of the sun was therefore not a single hand pushing the world in one direction. It was more like a weight placed onto many different structures. Some could carry it, some bent, some cracked where they were already thin. This makes the story less simple, but more honest. It allows us to see both the power of nature and the complexity of human life. It reminds us that people in the 6th century were not passive victims of the sky. They made decisions, used knowledge, argued, adapted, prayed, traded, stored, moved, endured, and sometimes failed. Their world was vulnerable, but it was also active. The sun's dimming mattered because it changed the conditions under which all that activity took place. It made the ancient dependence on light and warmth visible again, even inside empires and organized societies. But it did not erase politics, culture, disease, trade, or human choice. The most truthful way to understand 536 is not as the year that alone broke the world, but as a year when the natural foundation beneath human history became suddenly less reliable, and every society had to meet that loss with whatever strength, weakness, memory, and fear it already carried. One difficult year can pass across the sky and still remain on the ground. The light may slowly return, the air may grow warmer again, the next spring may arrive with more familiar signs. Yet human communities do not recover at the same speed as the weather. A bad year can leave fewer stores, weaker animals, exhausted bodies, lost seed, delayed marriages, smaller households, and memories that change how people face the next season. This is why the events around 536 cannot be measured only by asking what happened during the months of dim sunlight. The deeper question is what those months did to the years that followed. A cold and uncertain growing season could reduce the food available for winter. A thin winter could weaken the people who had to plant in spring. A weaker spring workforce could mean less land prepared, fewer animals used well, and more caution in planting. If another difficult season followed, the problem would no longer be one year standing alone. It would become a chain. Human life depends on continuity. Each generation receives more than blood from the generation before it. It receives stored food, tools, animals, land, habits, warnings, songs, obligations, and expectations about how the world behaves. When a climate shock damages that continuity, the harm can move quietly from present hunger into future vulnerability. A household that eats its seed grain survives the moment, but risks the next harvest. A family that loses animals loses not only food, but labour, manure, transport, warmth, and security. A community that sees many people leave in search of food may lose hands needed for planting, repairing, watching children, and caring for elders. These are population effects, but they begin as ordinary choices. The body makes history before records name it. In times of shortage, births may decline, children may become more vulnerable, older people may be at greater risk, and illness may find bodies with less strength to resist. None of this needs to be imagined as a single universal collapse. It is enough to see how a repeated pressure can change the shape of a population over time. Human beings have always lived with this kind of delayed consequence. In the deep beginning of our species, a failed season could affect movement, fertility, survival, and group size. A band that found enough food could protect children and elders more easily. A band that endured repeated scarcity might split, move, lose members, or become more dependent on uncertain resources. Agriculture changed the setting, but not the logic. By the 6th century, people were tied more tightly to fields, villages, estates, churches, states, and trade routes. Their lives were more organized, but also more exposed to the failure of fixed systems. When food production declined, the damage could pass through obligations as well as bodies. Taxes might still be expected. Rents might still be owed. Soldiers might still need supply. Religious communities might still need support. Families might still need to keep children alive through winter. A single harvest failure could therefore become a test of every relationship that rested on surplus. If the surplus was gone, people had to decide who would bear the loss. That decision could shape social tension, migration, debt, and trust. The phrase "many years cold" should be understood with care, because climate records and regional histories do not always show the same pattern in the same way. But the basic risk is clear. When hardship is repeated, or when one bad year leaves little protection against the next, recovery becomes difficult. A granary can be emptied faster than it is filled. An animal herd can be reduced in a season and take years to rebuild. A child weakened early in life may carry the cost longer than the bad weather itself. A community that loses confidence in normal seasons may become more cautious, more fearful, or more likely to move. These changes are hard to see in grand political histories because they do not always leave monuments, yet they are among the most important effects of environmental stress. They happen at the scale where human history began, the scale of food, birth, care, movement, and survival. In 536, the dimmed sun was not only a strange sight above the world, it may have been the beginning of a longer strain for many people, especially if followed by further cold years or poor harvests. The sky may have changed first, but the population carried the aftershock. The living had to continue with what remained. The next season did not begin on clean ground. It began with bodies already tired, stores already reduced, and decisions already made under pressure. This is how one abnormal year can reach beyond itself. It enters the future not as a legend, but as a smaller reserve, a missing animal, a weakened child, an abandoned field, a postponed birth, a journey away from home. The sun may return, but the people beneath it may not be the same. When food becomes uncertain, not every body carries the same risk. A cold year may touch an entire landscape, but hunger enters people unevenly. It reaches first toward those with the least reserve, children whose bodies are still growing, elders whose strength is already thinner, poor households with little stored grain, labourers paid close to the edge of survival, isolated families without strong kinship support, and communities whose crops depend on a narrow season. This unevenness is one of the quiet facts beneath the story of 536. The dimmed sky may have been broad, but vulnerability was personal. A ruler could hear reports of shortage and think in terms of supply, taxes, order, and movement. A landowner might calculate rents and stores. A trader might think of prices, roads, and risk. But in the smallest rooms, the question was simpler and more severe. Who eats enough today, and who quietly receives less? In times of shortage, families often try to protect the young, yet children are also the most exposed to long weakness. A child needs food not only to stay alive, but to grow. Growth is a form of future being built inside the present body. When food is poor for many weeks or months, that future can become more fragile. The child may become weaker, more vulnerable to illness, less able to endure cold, and more dependent on adults who are themselves under strain. The elderly face a different kind of danger. Their lives carry memory, skill, and authority, but their bodies may have less ability to recover from hunger, infection, and cold. A smaller meal, a colder sleeping place, a longer winter, or the loss of steady care can matter more sharply at the end of life. In a hard year, a community may not lose people evenly. It may lose those whose bodies had the least margin left. The poor also stand closer to danger because poverty is often a lack of buffers. A household with grain stored from earlier years can wait longer. A household with animals can sometimes sell, slaughter, milk, or trade. A household with relatives in another village may ask for help. But a poor family may have little to sell except labour, and labour loses value when hunger has already weakened the body. This is where climate becomes social. The same pale sun shines above everyone, but it does not meet everyone equally. Some people have walls, barns, networks, authority, and stored food between themselves and the weather. Others have only the strength of their own hands. Human beings have lived with this unequal exposure since deep time. Even among early foraging groups, age, injury, pregnancy, childhood, and social belonging could shape survival. A strong adult might travel farther for food. A child could not. An injured person depended on care. An elder depended on the group's willingness and ability to share. The difference in agricultural societies was that inequality could become more fixed through land, ownership, debt, and obligation. By the 6th century, many people lived within systems where food was not only grown, but claimed, taxed, rented, stored, traded, and controlled. When the harvest narrowed, the struggle over distribution could become as important as the harvest itself. Who had the right to take grain? Who had to pay? Who could delay payment? Who could borrow? Who could leave? Who was trapped? A climate shock does not answer these questions, but it makes them harder to avoid. If the sky dimmed and crops suffered, then the pressure would fall through the layers of society until it reached bodies with the fewest protections. This is why a population effect can begin invisibly. It may appear first as mothers eating less, elders growing quiet, children becoming thinner, workers losing strength, servants moving away, or the poor selling small possessions. These details are often absent from official histories because they did not always seem worthy of record. But they are history at its most basic level. They show how an environmental event becomes human loss. A poor harvest does not hurt only as an amount of missing grain. It hurts as a reordering of care, strength, and hope. It asks households to decide whose needs are urgent, whose hunger can be postponed, and how long love can make up for scarcity. No careful telling should claim to know the private scenes of every 6th century family. Those inner rooms are mostly lost. Yet the biological and social pattern is clear enough to speak honestly. When food, warmth, and certainty decline, those with fewer reserves face greater danger. The dimming of 536, therefore, belongs not only to the history of climate, but to the history of unequal bodies beneath the same sky. The sun may have seemed weak to all who saw it, but its weakness would have been felt most deeply by those already living near the edge of survival. In them, the strange year could become more than memory. It could become a shorter life, a weaker generation, a journey away from home, or a name never written down. The greatest losses in history are not always the ones that receive names. A ruler can be remembered, a battle can be dated, a city can leave walls, coins, inscriptions, and ruins. But a child who did not survive a hungry winter may leave no record at all. An old woman who ate less so others could eat may disappear from history. A labourer weakened by poor harvests may be remembered only as an absence in the next season's work. This is why the human cost of a year like 536 must be approached with humility. The evidence can show dim light, cold, poor growth, and atmospheric disturbance. It can suggest pressure on crops and bodies, but the people most affected were often the least likely to be written about. Their suffering may have passed through family memory, grief, and practical decisions, then faded before it could enter the archives. History often preserves the voices of those who had power, writing, and institutions. Hunger, however, often begins among those with little power to record it. A poor household does not leave many documents when grain runs low. A migrant family may vanish from one place and appear nowhere clearly in another. A weakened child may never become an adult whose name can be counted in tax records. The silence is not proof that nothing happened. It is often the shape that ordinary loss leaves behind. This has been true since the beginning of human life. Most of our ancestors left no names. They left tools, bones, hearths, footprints, and traces of movement, but not the inner record of fear, care, hunger, or hope. Yet the human species was carried forward by countless unnamed lives. Every generation depended on people who gathered food, protected children, shared knowledge, endured cold, and made decisions no chronicle could preserve. In 536, the same deep pattern remained. The large event was in the sky, but its most intimate consequences may have lived among people whose names were never written down. A failed harvest could mean a ruler worried about revenue. It could mean a city watched prices rise, but for a poor family, it could mean the slow narrowing of life itself. Fewer meals, weaker bodies, delayed recovery, harder work, and the quiet fear that tomorrow would demand more than they could give. Population change is often discussed through numbers, but each number hides a personal world. A decline in births is also a young couple waiting because the future feels unsafe. A rise in deaths is also a bed made empty. Migration is also a doorway left behind, a field abandoned, a familiar path no longer walked. These are not decorations added to the past, they are the substance of human history. A society is not made only of kings, armies, and laws. It is made of bodies that must be fed, warmed, rested, and protected across time. When those bodies weaken, the future changes quietly. The next harvest has fewer hands. The next household has fewer children. The next memory has more caution. A climate shock can therefore survive inside a population long after the sky begins to clear. It can remain in missing people, smaller families, lost skills, abandoned land, and stories told without exact dates. The dimming of 536 asks us to look for that kind of loss. Not only the visible drama of a pale sun, but the invisible arithmetic of survival beneath it. We cannot name most of those who bore the cost, and we should not pretend to know their private thoughts. But we can recognize the conditions under which ordinary life becomes fragile. We can see that a weakened season would have pressed hardest on those already near the edge. We can understand that the past was carried by people whose silence is not emptiness, but evidence of how much history disappears before it can be written. Disease does not need a darkened sun in order to exist. It has its own paths, its own carriers, its own timing, and its own biological causes. For that reason, the years after 536 must be approached carefully. It would be false to say that a dim sky simply created every later illness, every social disturbance, or every death. Human history is not built from such simple lines, yet it would also be false to pretend that climate, hunger, movement, and disease live in separate worlds. They often meet inside the same body. A cold year can weaken food systems. Weak food systems can reduce strength. Reduced strength can make people less able to endure infection. Shortage can push people to move, crowd, trade under pressure, or depend on unfamiliar routes of supply. These conditions do not create disease from nothing, but they can change the world through which disease moves. That distinction is important. Climate can be a background pressure, a weakening force, a condition that makes other dangers harder to survive. It does not need to be the single cause in order to matter. In the middle of the 6th century, people were already living in connected worlds. Ships crossed seas, armies moved. Merchants carried goods. Pilgrims, officials, laborers, and displaced people traveled between regions. Cities gathered many bodies close together, while countryside and ports fed them through networks that depended on season, storage, and transport. In such a world, a climate shock could have indirect effects. If harvests failed or became uncertain, food might have to move farther. If people became hungry, they might leave home. If animals weakened or died, livelihoods changed. If prices rose, social trust could thin. If bodies were underfed, illness could become more dangerous. None of these consequences has to be imagined as immediate or universal. They are possibilities supported by the basic relationship between environment, food, movement, and health. Human beings have carried that relationship from the beginning. Long before cities existed, a bad season could change where a group moved, what it ate, how close people stayed together, and how much energy they had to resist injury or sickness. A body short of food is still alive, but it may have less reserve. A body exposed to cold must spend energy staying warm. A tired group may make different decisions from a well-fed one. These truths are not dramatic. They are biological and social facts that have shaped human life for thousands of generations. By 536, the same old facts were operating inside more complex societies. Hunger was no longer only a matter of finding fewer roots, fruits, or animals in a landscape. It could also involve grain markets, tax demands, urban supply, military needs, and unequal access to stores. Disease was no longer only a small group's problem. In connected societies, illness could travel with people, animals, trade, and war. This does not mean climate explains disease. It means climate can change the stage on which disease appears. A society with strong harvests, good reserves, and stable movement may meet an outbreak differently from a society already strained by cold, poor crops, high prices, or displacement. The same infection can have different effects depending on the condition of the people it reaches. That is why the years after 536 are so difficult and so important to tell honestly. A weakened sun did not write every later event, but it may have helped weaken the world that later events entered. Social disturbance works in a similar way. People do not rebel, migrate, or lose trust only because the weather changes. They respond to hunger, fear, obligation, debt, belief, violence, leadership, and memory. A poor harvest can sharpen these pressures without controlling them completely. If a ruler still demands taxes when granaries are thin, resentment can grow. If food prices rise, cities can become anxious. If families move in search of survival, old communities can change. If religious thinkers see a strange sky and suffering together, They may interpret the moment through moral or cosmic language. These responses belong to culture, not climate alone, but climate can make them more urgent. It can reduce the room in which patience survives. It can turn ordinary inequality into visible danger. It can make the difference between hardship and crisis smaller. The year 536 is therefore not a simple bridge from dim sunlight to disease or unrest. It is better understood as a broad environmental shock that may have lowered resilience in some places. Resilience means the ability to absorb a difficulty and continue. A stored harvest is resilience. Healthy animals are resilience. Trust between neighbors is resilience. Strong bodies are resilience. Safe roads, fair distribution, and reliable leadership are resilience. When cold, dim light, and poor growth reduce these protections, later shocks can strike harder. The truth is quiet but serious. The sky may not have caused every wound, yet it may have made many wounds harder to heal. The plague that later came to be associated with the reign of Justinian belongs to the same troubled century, but it must not be folded too easily into the darkness of 536. It was a disease event with its own biological cause, its own movement through human and animal worlds, and its own timing. To treat it as a simple consequence of a dimmed sun would be inaccurate. Yet the nearness of these shocks in time still matters, because human societies do not experience hardship in sealed compartments. A cold year, a poor harvest, weakened trade, anxious cities, moving armies, crowded ports, and undernourished bodies can all become part of the condition in which later disease is felt. The plague did not need the sky of 536 inches order to exist, but a world under environmental stress may have met it with less strength than a world of full harvests and stable reserves. This is the careful middle ground. It neither ignores climate uncertain nor turns climate into a single master cause. In the Eastern Roman world, the 6th century was already a period of large ambition and heavy demand. Armies moved, taxes were collected, cities depended on flows of grain, goods, and people. The Mediterranean remained a connected space, joined by ships, markets, ports, roads, officials, religious travel, and military campaigns. Connection brings vitality, but it also brings risk. What moves food can also move fear. What moves trade can also move illness. A great city can gather wealth and ceremony, but it also gathers bodies close together. If supplies are strained, if prices rise, if people move because local life has become harder, then the conditions around health and disease can change. None of this proves a direct line from the dim sun to the plague. It only reminds us that disease enters a living society, not an empty map. The condition of that society matters. A hungry body is not the same as a well-fed body. A crowded port under stress is not the same as a calm one. A state already carrying military and fiscal burdens is not the same as a state with wide reserves and few demands. Human beings have always faced illness within the wider environment of survival. In the deep past, before cities, infection, injury, hunger, and climate were never separate experiences. A group short of food had less energy to care for the sick. A cold season made recovery harder. Movement in search of resources could bring people into new contact with other groups, animals, and landscapes. By the 6th century, the same basic pattern continued on a larger scale. Roads and ships extended the range of human contact. Grain supply connected countryside to city. Armies connected frontiers to capitals. A disturbance in food or movement could therefore spread through systems that were already capable of carrying disease. The Justinianic plague is often remembered because it struck a world with writing, administration, and imperial memory. Chroniclers described its terror in language shaped by their own understanding. Modern science identifies plague as a disease caused by a bacterium, not by a moral sign in the heavens, but the historical experience of plague cannot be reduced to the bacterium alone. Disease becomes history when it meets people, their nutrition, housing, movement, fear, burial practices, care systems, work obligations, and political structures. If the years after 536 included repeated cold, uncertain harvests, or weakened resilience in some regions, then the arrival of plague would have found communities with less room to absorb another blow. This does not mean every death from plague was caused by climate. It means that environmental stress may have shaped how societies endured disease, how quickly they recovered, and how deeply the losses entered population and memory. The distinction is important for honesty. A listener should not come away believing that a volcano created the plague in a simple chain. The better understanding is slower and more difficult. A possible volcanic winter may have reduced light and warmth. Reduced light and warmth may have contributed to poor harvests and hardship in some places. Hardship may have lowered resilience. Then, when plague emerged and spread through connected human and animal networks, it entered a world that may already have been under strain. Each step has its own uncertainty. Each step must be handled with care. But together they show why the mid-6th century felt so heavy in later memory. The darkness was not alone. The cold was not alone. Hunger was not alone. Disease was not alone. They belonged to a century in which different forms of vulnerability could overlap. For ordinary people, the question was not whether climate, bacteria, empire, or trade was the main cause. The question was whether there would be food, whether the sick could be cared for, whether work could continue, whether children would live, whether the next season would be kinder. The sky of 536 may have been one pressure among several, but when pressures arrive close together, the human body and the human community feel them as one long difficulty. When many troubles appear close together in time, the human mind naturally tries to tie them into one story. A dim sun, cold years, poor harvests, hunger, movement, disease, and political strain seem to call for a single explanation. It feels easier to say that one event caused the others, that one hidden eruption began a chain that can be followed without uncertainty. But truthful history is usually more patient than that. It asks us to separate three things that are often confused: events that happen near each other, events that may be connected, and events that can be shown with strong evidence to have a direct relationship. The difference may sound small, but it is the difference between understanding the past and simplifying it too much. Correlation means that two things appear near each other in time or place. The dimming around 536 and later hardship belong to the same broader period. That closeness is important. It tells us where to look. It invites questions. But it does not by itself prove that one thing caused the other. Possible connection is stronger. East we can see a reasonable pathway. A volcanic disturbance could reduce sunlight. Reduced sunlight could cool growing seasons. Cooler growing seasons could weaken crops. Weaker crops could reduce food. Reduced food could weaken bodies and social systems. Weaker bodies and social systems could make later disease or unrest harder to survive. This pathway is plausible because it follows what is known about climate, agriculture, nutrition, and society. But plausibility is still not the same as certainty. Strong evidence requires multiple records, careful dating, comparison across regions, and a willingness to let some questions remain open. This is why the story of 536 should not be told as if every later wound has already been solved. Some links are supported more firmly than others. The evidence for atmospheric disturbance is strong. The evidence for unusual cold and poor growth in some records is strong enough to matter. The broader human consequences are real in mechanism, but uneven in detail. The exact experience of each region, each village, each household, and each body cannot be reconstructed completely. That does not make the event meaningless. It only makes the telling more careful. Human beings have always lived inside this tension between what is felt and what is proven. Our earliest ancestors did not need formal evidence to know that a season was dangerous. They could feel hunger, cold, and fear directly. But from the distance of many centuries, we cannot simply borrow that feeling and turn it into fact. We need traces. Written words, tree rings, ice chemistry, archaeological patterns, and the logic of human survival. Each trace has limits. A chronicle may carry belief as well as observation. A tree ring may reflect local stress. Ice may preserve a chemical signal without naming every consequence. Archaeology may show change without revealing a single cause. The honest work is not to force these traces into one dramatic answer, but to let them narrow the uncertainty. They tell us that the sky changed. They tell us the living world was stressed. They tell us that human societies could have become more vulnerable. They do not give permission to invent a clean line from the pale sun to every death, every migration, every war, or every disease. This caution is especially important because simple explanations can feel powerful. They make the past easier to remember, but they can also erase the people who lived inside complexity. A hungry family was not only a victim of climate, it may also have been shaped by land ownership, debt, local authority, stored food, kinship, illness, age, and luck. A city under pressure was not only responding to weather, it was also responding to trade, politics, military demand, belief, and administration. A disease outbreak was not only a story of weakened bodies, it also had biological causes and routes of transmission that must be respected. To keep these causes separate is not to weaken the story. It is to make room for the real world. In the real world, the same shock can pass through different lives in different ways. One household survives because it has grain. Another leaves because it has none. One town receives food by sea. Another watches its local fields fail. One region records the strange sky. Another leaves little evidence. The sun may have dimmed across wide distances, but human consequences were filtered through the structures people had built and the vulnerabilities they already carried. The year 536, therefore, teaches a quiet discipline of thought. It asks us to notice patterns without rushing to close them. It asks us to honor uncertainty without pretending the evidence is empty. It asks us to see climate not as a magical cause of everything, but as a deep condition that can make many other pressures more severe. For people who lived then, the distinctions between correlation, possible connection, and proof would not have mattered in those words. They lived inside the consequences. But for us, telling their story centuries later, the distinction matters greatly. It keeps the darkness from becoming myth. It lets the pale sun remain what it was, not the answer to every question, but one large shadow crossing a world already full of fragile human lives. People in the 6th century did not have satellites, pressure maps, chemical measurements, or instruments that could read the upper atmosphere. They could not compare temperatures across continents or drill into ice to find traces of distant eruptions. Yet it would be a mistake to imagine them as careless observers of the sky. Their lives required attention. They watched clouds because clouds could mean rain, delay, travel danger, or relief. They watched the color of dawn because morning told them something about the day ahead. They watched the length of light because work, prayer, travel, planting, and harvest all depended on it. They watched the moon, the stars, the winds, the feel of air before a storm, the behavior of animals, the wetness of soil, the sharpness of frost, and the first signs of growth in plants. Their knowledge was not modern science, but it was not empty. It was lived knowledge, gathered through repetition, memory, and necessity. A person who depends on a field learns to notice small changes in that field. A sailor learns to read water and wind. A shepherd learns the meaning of pasture and animal movement. A traveller learns which weather makes a road unsafe. A community that survives by harvests learns the difference between a difficult week and a season that has begun to go wrong. This is why the old descriptions of a dim sun matter. They came from people who lived close enough to natural cycles to recognize when something was out of order. They may have explained it through religion, omen, divine judgment, or cosmic imbalance, depending on their world of thought, but the observation beneath the meaning should not be dismissed. When Procopius or Cassiodorus wrote of weakened light, strange seasons, or a sun without its ordinary force, they were not writing from a world where the sky was irrelevant. They were writing from societies that still measured much of life by the sky's reliability. For modern readers, the danger is to separate observation from interpretation too sharply, or not sharply enough. If an ancient writer says the sun shone like an eclipse, that does not mean the writer knew about volcanic aerosols. It also does not mean the writer saw nothing real. The phrase may be literary, emotional, or shaped by the language of wonder, but it can still preserve a genuine memory of dimness. The task is to listen without surrendering judgment. Ancient people were capable of careful noticing, even when their explanations were different from ours. In fact, their closeness to the environment may have made them sensitive to changes many modern people would miss. Today, artificial light, heating, stored food, global trade, weather forecasts, and indoor life can soften the direct presence of the sky. A cloudy week may be inconvenient, A cold summer may be discussed through screens and forecasts, but for much of human history, the sky entered the body more directly. It decided whether soil warmed, whether grain ripened, whether roads dried, whether animals found pasture, whether firewood cured, whether a journey could continue, and whether a household felt safe going into winter. This relationship reaches back far beyond written history. The first humans did not need myths or calendars to understand that the sky mattered. Light opened the world, darkness narrowed it, weather shaped hunger, seasons shaped movement. The human mind became attentive because inattentive beings did not survive well in changing landscapes. By 536, this ancient attention had been carried into cities, monasteries, farms, ports, and courts. The tools had changed, but the habit of looking upward remained. When the sun seemed weaker than it should, people did not need instruments to feel that something essential had shifted. They could compare the present with memory. They could ask elders whether such a sky had been seen before. They could measure the year by its consequences: poor warmth, slow growth, uneasy harvests, strange cold, and the feeling that time itself had become unreliable. Their records are not perfect windows. No human record is. They are fragments, shaped by language, belief, fear, and purpose. But fragments can still carry truth. A broken piece of pottery can tell us about a vessel. A narrow tree ring can tell us about a season. A worried sentence about the sun can tell us that the sky had become worthy of remembrance. The people of 536 did not know the full cause above them, yet they knew enough to notice that the familiar light had changed. And for a species whose long history began with watching the world carefully in order to live, that act of noticing was itself a form of survival. When the sky becomes strange, people do not remember it only as weather. They remember it through the forms of meaning available to them. In the 6th century, those forms could include prayer, omen, chronicle, sermon, court writing, local story, family warning, and the repeated speech of people trying to understand why the year had lost its normal order. A dim sun was not simply a visual detail. It touched food, warmth, work, travel, illness, and fear. Because of that, it could enter memory through many doors at once. A monk might place it in a written account because it seemed to belong among signs of disorder. A court official might describe it because strange seasons affected public life, supply, and the mood of society. A farmer might not write anything at all, but might carry the memory in practical language. The year when the light was weak, the year when crops were late, the year when summer did not feel like summer. These forms of memory are different, but they are not separate from the event. They show how human beings turn an environmental shock into something that can be spoken, repeated, cult in passed forward. Long before writing, our species survived by carrying memory this way. A dangerous valley, a season of hunger, a river crossing, a time when animals moved differently, a plant that ripened late, a winter that killed many people. Such knowledge had to be remembered or the group would suffer again. Human memory began not as decoration, but as survival. It helped people connect the present with past danger. By 536, memory had more formal containers. There were books, annals, religious institutions, educated writers, imperial offices, and communities that understood events through inherited beliefs. Yet beneath these formal containers was the same old human need, to make a pattern from danger so life could continue. When the sun seemed weak, the mind did not meet that change in emptiness. It met it through stories already available. Some people may have understood the dimness as a divine sign. Others may have treated it as an omen, a warning, or a disorder in creation. Others may have cared less about explanation than survival. We do not need to decide one private thought for all of them. The evidence does not allow that. What we can say is simpler and stronger. A changed sky was the kind of event that demanded interpretation because it touched the foundation of ordinary life. The deeper the dependence, the stronger the memory. If a strange light had no consequences, it might have faded from record. But when pale daylight is linked with cold, poor growth, or hunger, it becomes harder to forget. Memory then attaches itself not only to what was seen, but to what followed. A person remembers the sky because the harvest failed. A community remembers the cold because the stores ran low. A writer records the strange sun because it seemed to explain a wider unease. This is how environmental events become historical memory. They do not remain pure observations. They gather meaning as they pass through human need. The same process has shaped human cultures across time. Floods, droughts, eclipses, comets, famines, and long winters often became more than natural events in memory because they unsettled the relationship between human beings and the world that fed them. A modern explanation can describe particles, climate, and crop stress, but it should not erase the older human experience of wonder and fear. For the people beneath the dim sky, the cause was hidden. They lived inside the effect. They saw morning arrive without full reassurance. They waited for warmth. They measured fields. They watched animals. They counted stores. They listened to elders, priests, officials, neighbors, and travelers. Through these ordinary acts, the event entered shared memory. It may have been written in a chronicle, but it was also written in caution. It may have been interpreted through religion, but it was also interpreted through hunger. It may have been remembered as a sign from above, but it was also a sign that the season below could not be trusted. This is why the title's question still has power. The sun did not vanish in a literal astronomical sense, yet for those who lived under weakened light, the change may have felt like a loss of the world's oldest promise. Human beings had always looked upward not only for beauty, but for permission to live another day. In 536, that permission seemed less certain, and uncertainty is one of the strongest things memory can preserve. History is often remembered through visible things: ruins, crowns, wars, roads, laws, ships, coins, and the names of rulers. These things are easier to place in a story because they leave shapes behind. A wall can still stand, a document can still be read, a battlefield can be mapped. But some of the most important human experiences do not leave such clear edges. They live in the way people understood danger, waited through uncertainty, and tried to make sense of forces that no hand could touch. The dimming of 536 belongs to that quieter layer of history. It was not only a physical event in the atmosphere, it was also an event in human understanding. People looked upward and found the sky less familiar. They looked at fields and found the season less dependable. They looked at stores and bodies and saw that the future had become more difficult to trust. This kind of experience changes memory because it places human beings in front of a scale larger than their own power. A person can mend a roof, sharpen a tool, move an animal, repair a road, or carry grain from one room to another. A community can pray, ration, trade, store, travel, and organize labor. But no village, city, or empire in the 6th century could command the sun to brighten. No ruler could order the upper air to clear. No household could negotiate with the forces that scattered light before it reached the soil. That helplessness does not make people passive. It shows the real boundary between human action and the wider world. Our species has lived at that boundary from the beginning. The earliest humans survived because they acted with intelligence inside conditions they did not control. They could choose a path, but not create the rain. They could remember a food source, but not make every season generous. They could gather close for safety, but not remove every predator, illness, cold night, or failed landscape. Human culture grew in that space between agency and dependence. It gave people tools, stories, rituals, cooperation, and memory. It helped them endure what could not be mastered. In 536, that ancient condition returned, in a form that even complex societies could not escape. The world had empires, churches, written laws, long-distance trade, and urban life. Yet the basic human question remained very old. What do we do when the environment that sustains us no longer behaves as expected? The answer was not the same everywhere. Some people may have understood the dimness through divine warning. Some may have treated it as a sign of cosmic disorder. Some may have cared mainly about the harvest. Some may have remembered it only through hunger, cold, or loss. Many left no words at all, but the shared human situation was clear. They were trying to understand an event whose cause lay beyond their reach. This is where history becomes more than a list of events. It becomes the study of human meaning under pressure. A strange sky is not only strange because of its color, It is strange because people have expectations about the sky. They expect morning to release them into work. They expect summer to build food. They expect the sun to mark time in a way that can be trusted. When those expectations fail, the mind searches for explanation. This search is not weakness. It is one of the deepest human responses to uncertainty. To explain is to reduce fear, to prepare behavior, to place suffering inside a pattern. Sometimes the explanation is scientific. Sometimes it is religious. Sometimes it is practical and local. Sometimes it is incomplete. But the need to explain comes from the same root as the need to survive. A world without pattern is hard to live in. The people of 536 did not have the tools to know what later ice cores and tree rings would suggest. They could not see volcanic material moving through high air. They could not compare distant climates with precision. Yet they could recognize disruption. They could remember it. They could pass it into words, rituals, warnings, and records. Their interpretations may not be ours, but their attention was real. The event mattered because it disturbed one of the oldest relationships in human life, the relationship between the body and the sky. It showed that the sun could still rise and yet fail to reassure. It showed that daylight could exist and still feel insufficient. It showed that civilization, for all its structures, still rested on something as simple and unreachable as warmth arriving from above. That is why the memory of 536 should not be treated only as a mystery to solve. It is also a reminder of how humans face the unsolved. We observe, compare, fear, interpret, remember, and continue. We build stories not because stories replace evidence, but because human beings need meaning while evidence is still incomplete. The dim sun of 536 entered chronicles, science, and imagination because it stood at the edge of what people could know. It was a sky event, a climate event, a food event, and a memory event at once, and perhaps that is why it still feels close. Beneath all our later knowledge, we remain the same kind of creature in one essential way. We live by signs from a world larger than ourselves, and when those signs change, we begin to ask what the world is trying to tell us. To say that nobody knows why the sun seemed to vanish in 536 is both true and incomplete. It is true because the event is not solved in the simple way a broken tool is solved, with one visible cause placed neatly beside one visible effect. The exact source, timing, spread, and local consequences remain difficult. But it is incomplete because modern knowledge has not left us in total darkness. The mystery has edges. It has evidence. It has a shape that has grown clearer as different records have been brought together. Ancient writers described a sun without its normal strength, a light that seemed diminished, seasons that felt disturbed, and years of hardship. Trees from some regions show signs of poor growth around this time, as if the living world itself had slowed under difficult conditions. Ice preserves chemical traces that point toward volcanic material entering the atmosphere. Climate science gives a mechanism by which such material could reflect sunlight, cool the surface, and disturb growing seasons. None of these forms of evidence is perfect alone, but together they make the event more than a legend. They show that the strange year remembered in words also left marks in wood, ice, and climate patterns. That matters because it changes how the story should be told. The title asks why nobody knows why, but the more careful answer is that knowledge exists in layers. At one layer, the old witnesses tell us that people noticed a serious change in daylight and season. At another layer, the trees tell us that growth became difficult in ways consistent with unusual cold or stress. At another layer, ice tells us that the atmosphere received material likely linked to volcanic activity. At another layer, science explains how particles high above the clouds can reduce the energy reaching fields, bodies, and forests. This is not ignorance. It is partial understanding. It is the kind of understanding that comes when a distant event must be reconstructed from traces instead of direct observation. The people of 536 could feel the effects but not identify the cause. We can identify a likely cause but not fully recover every effect as they lived it. Between those two limits, the story becomes honest. Human beings have always lived between what they can feel and what they can prove. In the deep origin of our species, a person did not need to know the physics of climate to understand a bad season. Hunger was proof enough at the level of the body. Cold was proof enough at the level of skin. Failed growth was proof enough at the level of survival. But many centuries later, when we try to tell the story responsibly, feeling is not enough. We need independent records. We need to compare one kind of trace with another. A sentence in a chronicle becomes stronger when it agrees with tree rings. A tree ring signal becomes more meaningful when ice also shows atmospheric disturbance. An ice signal becomes more useful when climate science explains a pathway from volcanic gases to dimmer light in colder seasons. The past becomes clearer not because one witness is absolute, but because different witnesses, created by different processes, point toward the same broad event. Still, clarity has a boundary. We can say that a major atmospheric disturbance probably occurred. We can say that volcanic activity is the leading explanation. We can say that reduced sunlight and cooler conditions could have harmed crops and weakened societies in some places. But we should not pretend to know every village's harvest, every household's hunger, every child's illness, every journey, or every private fear. Those details are mostly gone. The evidence does not allow us to turn possibility into certainty wherever we wish. This is especially important because the year 536 invites exaggeration. A pale sun becomes a vanished sun. A cold year becomes the end of the world. A volcanic explanation becomes a completed answer to every later crisis. But the more useful truth is slower. The sun did not vanish from the universe. The world did not become one single scene of darkness. Human history did not collapse from one cause alone. Instead, a disturbance high in the atmosphere seems to have weakened the light that reached many people in many fields, and that weakening entered societies already shaped by food systems, inequality, disease, war, storage, belief, and local resilience. The power of the event lies in that interaction. It was natural, but its consequences were human. It was atmospheric, but it reached the stomach. It was distant, but it became intimate. What we know, then, is enough to respect the seriousness of 536 without turning it into myth. We know that ancient people were not imagining an ordinary year. Cleep, we know that the living world shows signs of stress. We know that ice holds a volcanic signal. We know that the body, the crop, and the community all depend on the steady return of warmth and light. And we know that some questions remain open, not because the story is empty, but because the past preserves itself unevenly. The mystery is not a blank wall. It is a dim landscape with some paths visible and others fading into distance. To walk through it truthfully, we must accept both things at once. The evidence is real, and the silence is real too. What remains unknown about 536 is not a small detail at the edge of the story. It is part of the story itself. The evidence points toward a major atmospheric disturbance, most likely connected to volcanic activity, but the past does not hand us a single clear image of the mountain, the sky, the wind, the field, and the human body all at once. We are looking backward through fragments. Some fragments are chemical, held in ice. Some are biological, held in wood. Some are written, held in the words of people who saw the sky from below. Each fragment narrows the darkness, but none removes it entirely. The exact source of the eruption, or eruptions, is still not something that should be treated too casually. Different studies have examined possible regions and possible sequences, and the broader picture suggests that more than one volcanic event may have contributed to the cold and dim years of the 6th century. But to say volcano is not the same as knowing every necessary detail. A volcano has a place, a season, a height of plume, a chemical composition, a direction of spread, and a relationship with winds and climate systems already in motion. All of those details matter because they shape who feels the consequences and how long those consequences last. A volcanic cloud is not a simple blanket laid evenly over the earth. It is carried, thinned, concentrated, transformed, and eventually removed by a moving atmosphere. This means the dimming could be broad without being identical everywhere. Some regions may have seen a stronger loss of warmth. Others may have experienced unusual cold, rain, or poor growth in different degrees. Some may have been struck mainly through harvest failure. Others may have felt the shock through trade, prices, animal health, migration, or later disease, the human world beneath the sky was just as uneven as the atmosphere above it. This is why the phrase "the sun vanished for 18 months" must be held as a human memory of dimness, rather than a precise scientific measurement for every place on Earth. It describes the shock of altered daylight, but it does not tell us exactly how each region measured that alteration or how each community survived it. The remaining uncertainty also belongs to time. Did one eruption create the first great dimming, followed by later eruptions that prolonged cooling? Did the effects overlap with natural climate variation already present? How quickly did the atmosphere clear? How long did crops and bodies continue to carry the cost after the visible sky began to recover? These questions matter because human suffering is not always synchronized with the original cause. A cloud may thin before a granary is refilled. A cold year may end before a herd has recovered. A harvest may improve before a poor family has replaced what it sold or lost. The atmosphere can begin healing while the community remains damaged. That difference between environmental timing and human timing is one reason the 6th century feels so difficult to interpret. The cause may belong to a year, but the consequence may belong to many years. Human beings have always lived inside such delays. From the beginning of our species, a failed season could echo beyond the season itself. A hungry winter could affect birth, movement, strength, and memory long after the plants returned. A group that lost elders lost knowledge. A group that lost children lost future. A group that moved under pressure changed its relationships with land, animals, neighbors, and danger. By 536, these old patterns were embedded in larger societies. A bad season could become debt, tax failure, migration, social anxiety, military weakness, or reduced trust. But the evidence does not let us draw the same line everywhere. A weakened sky did not land on one single human condition. It landed on many conditions, each with its own ability to absorb or magnify the shock. This is where careful uncertainty becomes valuable. It prevents the story from becoming too clean. The unknowns remind us that the people of the past were not living inside a diagram. They were living inside local weather, local food systems, local obligations, and local hopes. A farmer might know only that the grain was poor. A merchant might know that prices changed. A parent might know that a child was weaker. A monk might write that the sun had lost its brightness. A ruler might see pressure in tax, supply, and order. Later, science can connect these experiences to atmosphere and volcanic traces, but it cannot recover every human path from cause to consequence. That limit should not frustrate the story. It should deepen it. The most honest understanding of 536 is not that we know nothing, and not that we know everything. It is that we know the broad shape of a real disturbance, while the precise map remains partly hidden. The year stands at the meeting point between evidence and silence. We can see the shadow, but not every object that cast it. We can see the cooling, but not every life it touched. We can see the likely volcanic signal, but not every road by which it entered history. And perhaps that is why the event still holds the mind so quietly. It shows how a single change in the sky can become many different histories on the ground, some recorded, some measured, and many lost before anyone could write them down. The unknown is not an empty space waiting to be filled with whatever sounds most dramatic. It is a boundary. In science, a boundary does not mean failure. It means honesty about where evidence ends and imagination begins. The year 536 needs that honesty, because it is easy to make the story larger than the traces allow. A weakened sun, a cold world, poor harvests, disease, fear, and struggling societies can be shaped into a single dark legend. But a legend, even when it begins with real evidence, can become untrue if every silence is filled too quickly. The more careful story is quieter. It says that ancient witnesses saw a strange dimness. It says that trees in some places grew poorly. It says that ice holds chemical signs consistent with volcanic material in the atmosphere. It says that such material can reflect sunlight and disturb climate. It says that food systems, bodies, and societies may have been weakened in serious ways. Then it stops where the evidence asks it to stop. It does not invent the exact thoughts of every farmer. It does not claim that every crop failed everywhere. It does not turn every disease, war, migration, or death into the direct result of one sky event. That restraint is not a weakness in the narrative. It is the thing that keeps the narrative trustworthy. Human beings have always been tempted to turn uncertainty into certainty, especially when fear is involved. In the deep past, a strange sky, a failed season, or a sudden sickness demanded explanation because explanation helped people endure. A pattern, even an incomplete one, is easier to live with than chaos. That ancient need is still inside us. Modern listeners also want a clear answer. They want to know which volcano, which year, which path through the air, which harvest failed, which empire weakened, which plague followed, which exact cause lies behind the title's mystery. Some of those questions have partial answers. Some may one day become clearer. Some may remain permanently blurred because the people who lived through the event did not leave enough behind. The past is not obligated to preserve itself for us. It leaves bones without voices, rings without feelings, ice without names, and chronicles without complete context. We have to work with what remains. That work requires humility. Humility does not mean refusing to draw conclusions. It means drawing conclusions at the right strength. If evidence is strong, we can say so. If a connection is plausible, we can say it is plausible. If a claim is uncertain, we must let it remain uncertain. This matters especially for a story about the sun, because the sun belongs to the deepest layer of human trust. Since the beginning of our species, daylight has structured movement, safety, warmth, food, and rest. A disturbance in that pattern touches the imagination as well as the body. It is natural to feel the weight of it, but the feeling must not outrun the evidence. The people of 536 deserve more than a dramatic myth. They deserve a careful reconstruction of the world they faced, a sky that seemed weakened, a season that may have turned difficult, a food system vulnerable to cold, and communities forced to endure causes they could not see. The value of the unknown is that it preserves the scale of what they faced. They did not live inside our completed explanation. They lived inside uncertainty. They saw effects without knowing the source. They made decisions without climate models, without global records, without ice chemistry, without the ability to ask what had happened across the whole hemisphere. To tell their story truthfully, we must leave room for that darkness. Not false darkness, not invented mystery, but the real darkness of limited knowledge. Science has narrowed it, and that is valuable. It has shown that the event was not merely a strange rumour. It has given the dim sun a physical pathway through atmosphere, climate, plants, and human vulnerability. Yet science also teaches restraint. A good answer does not always close every door. Sometimes it marks which doors are open, which are likely, and which should not be opened without evidence. The year 536 remains powerful because it stands between knowledge and silence. We know enough to see that something serious happened. We do not know enough to pretend that every consequence is visible. And in that balance lies the most useful lesson. Truth is not made stronger by exaggeration. It is made stronger by knowing exactly where to stop. The story of 536 becomes most useful when it stops being only a strange year in the past and begins to show us the shape of human life itself. It reminds us that human beings are strong, but not separate from the world that holds them. We have crossed ice, desert, forest, ocean, and mountain. We have built languages, cities, calendars, ships, archives, and sciences. We have learned to store grain, move food, heal wounds, measure weather, and look back into time through wood and ice. Yet beneath all of this achievement, the body remains an old creature of air, warmth, water, food, and sleep. It still depends on a thin layer of atmosphere, a steady rhythm of seasons, and the return of light from a star we cannot command. This is not a reason for fear. It is a reason for clarity. The world that supports human life is not infinitely solid. It is balanced through relationships, sunlight and cloud, soil and seed, ocean and wind, plant and animal, harvest and storage, body and community. A disturbance high above the ground can travel downward until it reaches the most ordinary human need. In 536, if volcanic material dimmed sunlight and cooled the air, the effect did not remain in the sky as an abstract event. It moved toward fields, toward animals, toward granaries, toward children, toward elders, toward sleep. That movement from atmosphere to body is the quiet lesson of the year. Civilization can give people many protections, but it cannot remove dependence. It can soften nature's blows, delay them, distribute them, explain them, and sometimes help people recover from them. But it cannot make human life independent from the systems that feed it. The people of the 6th century lived closer to that truth than many modern people do. Their light came from the sky, flame, and oil. Their food came from local or regional land, animals, labor, and trade. Their warmth came from bodies, clothing, shelter, fuel, and season. When the sky became strange, they had fewer layers of protection between climate and hunger. Modern life has added many layers. Electric light extends the day. Heating softens winter. Refrigeration preserves food. Global transport can move grain across oceans. Forecasts warn of storms. Science can identify forces that ancient people could only experience. These protections are real, and they are achievements of human cooperation and knowledge. Yet they should not make us forget the foundation underneath. Food still grows in climates. Water still moves through weather. Health still depends on bodies nourished by the living world. Sleep still comes most peacefully when the mind feels that tomorrow can be met. Human beings have not left the earth behind. We have only built more complex ways of living within it. The year 536 teaches humility because it shows how a distant and unseen cause can become close and physical. A mountain, perhaps far away from most witnesses, may have sent material into the atmosphere. That material may have weakened the sunlight over fields. Those fields may have produced less food. Less food may have weakened bodies and reduced resilience. The chain is long, but each link belongs to real life. It is the same kind of chain that has shaped our species from the beginning. Early humans survived by reading landscapes carefully because their lives depended on signs. They noticed weather, animals, plants, water, cold, heat, and danger. The ability to observe was not decoration, it was survival. Today, the tools are different, but the need for careful observation remains. We read ice cores, tree rings, sediments, written records, and climate data because the world still speaks through traces. The lesson is not that the past repeats itself in a simple way. It is that the past reveals the conditions under which human life becomes fragile. In 536, people did not need to understand the upper atmosphere for the upper atmosphere to matter. They did not need to know the source of the dimming for the dimming to affect crops, bodies, and memory. This is one of the deepest truths history can offer. Causes can be hidden while consequences are immediate. A person may live inside an effect long before anyone can name the cause. That is why a truthful memory of 536 has value. It reminds us to respect evidence, to avoid easy conclusions, and to notice the living systems that make ordinary peace possible. It also reminds us that human strength has never been the strength of independence. It has been the strength of attention, cooperation, adaptation, and memory. We survive not because the world is always stable, but because we learn how closely we belong to it. The value of 536 is not that it gives us a simple warning, as if one ancient year could explain every modern fear. Its value is quieter than that. It teaches a way of thinking. It asks us to be careful with evidence, patient with uncertainty, and humble before systems larger than ourselves. The people who lived beneath the dimmed sky did not have the tools to know what we can now suspect. They could not see sulfate in ice, compare tree rings across regions, or model the movement of particles in the upper atmosphere. But they could notice that the light was wrong. They could feel that the season had become less generous. They could see crops struggling, animals weakening, and households measuring food more carefully. Their knowledge was incomplete, but their experience was real. Modern science gives us a wider view, yet it also gives us a responsibility. When evidence is partial, we should not fill the silence with dramatic certainty. When the past is frightening, we should not make it more frightening than it was. When a title says the sun vanished, we should understand the force of that image while also keeping the truth clear. The sun did not disappear from the sky, but its warmth and brightness seem to have been reduced enough for human beings to remember the change. That difference matters. It is the difference between fear and understanding. It is also the difference between a story that only shocks the listener and a story that leaves the listener wiser. The educational value of this year lies in seeing how many layers connect the sky to human life. A distant eruption may have affected the air. The air may have affected sunlight. Sunlight affected temperature. Temperature affected plants. Plants affected food. Food affected bodies. Bodies affected work, care, movement, birth, illness, and sleep. No single link in this chain should be exaggerated, but the chain itself is real. Human beings have always lived inside such chains. From the first communities moving through wild landscapes to the farmers of late antiquity, from small villages to great cities, survival has depended on relationships that are often easy to forget when times are stable. The body needs food, but food needs growth. Growth needs seasons. Seasons depend on patterns in air, water, soil, and light. A society may build laws, beliefs, markets, and monuments, but beneath them lies the same living foundation. The year 536 gently strips away the illusion that history is only made by rulers and wars. It shows that history is also made by clouds too high to see clearly, by summers that do not warm enough, by grain that ripens poorly, by families forced to think differently about tomorrow. This does not reduce human dignity, it deepens it. It shows that people have always lived with forces beyond control, and still they observed, adapted, remembered, and continued. Their strength was not perfect knowledge. Their strength was endurance within uncertainty. That is a lesson worth carrying carefully. In our own time, we often want certainty quickly. We want every cause named, every consequence counted, every mystery closed. But the past teaches a slower discipline. Some things can be known well, some things can be known only partly. Some things must remain open because the evidence is not enough. Respecting that boundary does not weaken truth. It protects it. For a listener lying quietly at night, the story of 536 can offer more than fear of a darkened sun. It can offer perspective. Human life has always depended on gifts that arrive without command. Light, warmth, rain, harvest, breath, sleep, and the cooperation of others. To remember this is not to feel helpless, it is to feel connected. The people of 536 lived through a sky they could not explain, yet their traces still speak to us through words, trees, ice, and the logic of survival. They remind us that the world is larger than the human mind, but not beyond human attention. We may not control every force that shapes us, but we can learn to observe carefully, speak honestly, and refuse to turn uncertainty into false certainty. That may be the quiet message left by the dim sun. When the world becomes difficult to understand, the most human response is not to invent an easy answer, but to keep looking, keep learning, and keep enough humility to say what we know, what we do not know, and why both still matter. If the dimming of 536 leaves one final thought behind, it is not that the world is only fragile. It is that human life has always been a conversation with conditions larger than itself. We are not helpless in that conversation. We build shelters, grow food, share memory, make tools, measure the sky, study ice, read old words, and learn from what earlier generations could not explain. But we are also not separate from the air above us or the soil beneath us. The story began with a strange loss of confidence in daylight, and it ends with the same quiet truth that has followed human beings from the beginning. We live because the world keeps making life possible. The sun returns. Seasons turn. Plants grow. Water moves. Bodies rest. Communities carry one another across difficult intervals. Most of the time, these gifts are so familiar that they become invisible. Morning arrives, and we do not think of it as a miracle. Bread is eaten, and we do not always remember the field, the rain, the warmth, the seed, the labour, and the storage behind it. A peaceful night passes, and we may not notice how much trust is hidden inside sleep, but when the sky changes, the hidden structure becomes visible. A weaker sun reveals the chain. Light becomes warmth. Warmth becomes growth. Growth becomes food. Food becomes strength. Strength becomes work, care, patience, and the ability to face another day. This chain is ancient. It was there before farming, when our ancestors moved through landscapes of danger and possibility. It was there when people first planted grain and began to depend on harvests. It was there in the 6th century, beneath the pale sky that later generations would try to understand. And it remains here, even now, under all our modern layers of technology and knowledge. The lesson is not to fear the sky, but to respect the relationships that make ordinary life stable. The year 536 teaches that truth does not need exaggeration in order to be powerful. The sun did not literally disappear from the universe. The earth did not stop turning. But something seems to have changed the light enough for people to remember it, for trees to grow poorly, for ice to hold a chemical trace, and for history to preserve a sense of unease. That is already serious. It is serious because it shows how a distant cause can become a human condition. It is serious because it reminds us that climate is not a background decoration behind history, but part of the stage on which everybody lives. It is serious because the people most affected by hardship were often those least likely to be named. Their lives may not appear in the largest records, yet the meaning of the event rests partly with them. The child who needed warmth, the elder who needed care, the farmer who watched a field delay its promise, the household that counted grain more carefully, the traveller who looked at the strange light and wondered whether the road ahead still belonged to the world they knew. We cannot recover all of them. We should not pretend that we can. But we can honour them by telling the story without forcing it to become simpler than the evidence allows. There is a quiet dignity in saying that we know some things and not others. We know that ancient witnesses described a dim and weakened sun. We know that natural records point toward unusual stress in the climate system. We know that volcanic activity is the strongest explanation for a veil in the atmosphere. We know that food, bodies, disease, movement, and social order can all be affected when seasons become unreliable. But we do not know every source, every route through the air, every field that failed, every person who suffered, or every consequence that followed. The unknown remains, not as emptiness, but as a reminder of how carefully the past must be approached. Perhaps this is the final value of the story. It teaches patience. It teaches that a mystery is not permission to invent. It teaches that human beings are strong because they can learn, but wise only when they remember their limits. In 536, people lived beneath a sky they could not fully explain. Today, we can explain more, but not everything. Between their uncertainty and ours, there is a long human bridge made of attention, evidence, humility, and memory. And as the listener rests with this story, the question does not need to close. It can remain gently open, like a dim light at the edge of thought. If the oldest promise in human life is that morning will return, what does it mean that, once in history, morning came back for months without feeling fully like morning?